Hello and welcome to the deep, quiet hours of the night. Settle in, get comfortable, and let my voice be your guide into the shadows. I often wonder where and when these stories are being heard, in a bedroom in Bristol at 3 in the morning, on a late-night drive through rural Ohio, or perhaps through headphones in a silent apartment in Seoul. It creates a sense of a silent, shared vigil against the dark. So if you feel inclined, leave a comment below with the time and place your listening from. It helps me feel less alone here, talking into the void. And of course, if you enjoy these journeys into the unsettling, a simple like and subscription lets me know you'd like me to continue. Now, let's begin. First story, The Dust on the Dial. Alan lived a life measured not in moments, but in centuries. As an archivist, his days were spent in the quiet, dust-moted stillness of forgotten records, deciphering the fatting ink of lives long past. He found solace in the silence, a comforting counterpoint to the clamor of the modern world he largely ignored. His apartment, a compact space in an old building, reflected this preference, filled with antique books, a worn leather armchair, and the scent of aged paper. He was, by all accounts, a solitary man, content in his own company and the echoes of history. It was on a rare excursion, a Saturday afternoon foray into the city's dwindling antique district, that he first saw it. A small shop, its windows opaque with years of grime and neglect, bore a hand-scrawled sign, closing down, everything must go. Alan, usually immune to such commercial pleas, felt an inexplicable pull. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of forgotten lives, old wood, tarnished brass, and the faint, sweet decay of time itself. Amidst the clutter of chipped porcelain and moth-eaten textiles, it sat on a high shelf, almost hidden. It was a radio, an old Bakelite model from the 1940s, its casing a deep, lustrous brown, polished smooth by countless hands. The dial, a semicircle of creamy ivory, was marked with the names of long-defunct cities and frequencies that no longer existed. It had a certain elegance, a silent dignity that spoke of a bygone era. Alan picked it up. It was heavy, substantial, a testament to craftsmanship. He turned the tuning knob, feeling the satisfying resistance, but the speaker grill remained stubbornly silent. "Doesn't work, I'm afraid," the shop owner, a stooped woman with eyes as ancient as her wares, rasped from behind a counter piled high with forgotten trinkets. Been sitting there for years. A decorative piece, really. Alan nodded. He wasn't looking for functionality. He was looking for beauty, for connection to the past. He paid a modest sum and carried the radio home, cradling it like a fragile relic. He placed it on his bedside table, a silent sentinel beside his reading lamp. Its smooth, dark form contrasted sharply with the stark modernity of his digital alarm clock, a comforting anachronism in his otherwise Spartan bedroom. For weeks, it remained just that, a beautiful, silent object, gathering a fine, almost imperceptible layer of dust on its polished surface. His routine was unwavering. Work, a simple meal, an hour or two with a historical text, then sleep. The nights in his apartment were profoundly quiet, broken only by the distant hum of the city or the occasional creak of the old building settling. It was a silence he cherished, a canvas upon which his thoughts could drift undisturbed. Then came the night, It was 3:17 a.m. Alan knew the time precisely because the sudden, sharp crackle that tore through the profound stillness jolted him awake instantly. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, darted to the bedside table. The radio. Its single, small indicator light, a warm, amber glow, was on. A faint, almost imperceptible hum emanated from within its bakelite shell. He blinked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface. Had he accidentally bumped the power switch? He checked. No, it was off. Yet the light persisted, and the hum, a low, resonant thrum, filled the small space. Then the sounds began. It wasn't music. It wasn't speech. It wasn't the static-laced babble of a forgotten radio station. It was ambient. The first sound was a soft, rhythmic drip. Drip, drip, drip. It was slow, methodical, the sound of a leaky faucet in an unseen kitchen or bathroom. There was no accompanying echo, no sense of a large, empty space, just the intimate, close sound of water meeting porcelain. Alan held his breath, listening. The drip continued for several minutes, then faded, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum. This hum was different from the radio's internal thrum. It was the distinct, steady vibration of a refrigerator compressor. A sound so common, so mundane, yet utterly out of place, emanating from his silent radio. He could almost visualize the appliance, standing sentinel in a quiet kitchen, its contents unseen, its purpose fulfilled in the dark. He spent the rest of the night awake, mesmerized and unnerved. He tried tuning the dial, slowly, methodically, hopping to find a discernible station, a voice, anything that would explain this bizarre phenomenon. But the dial yielded nothing but the same strange, disembodied sounds. A faint creak, like a floorboard settling upstairs in an old house. The soft rustle of fabric, as if a curtain had just been disturbed by an unseen breeze. The distant, almost inaudible chime of a grandfather clock striking the hour in a silent hall. The next morning, the radio was dark again, silent. Alan poked at it, turned the switch on and off, but it remained inert. It was as if the night's events had been a dream, a trick of his sleep-addled mind. Yet, the memory of the sounds, so vivid and distinct, lingered. He was an archivist, a man of order and evidence. He needed to understand. That evening, he placed a small, portable digital recorder next to the radio. He set it to voice activation, hopping to capture any recurrence. It happened again, precisely at 3:17 a.m. The amber light, the low hum, and then the sounds. This time, he was ready. He lay perfectly still, listening as the recorder's tiny red light flickered, capturing every subtle nuance. Over the next few weeks, this became his new, unsettling nocturnal ritual. The radio, his silent companion by day, transformed into a conduit to unseen, unheard spaces by night. He began a meticulous log. Each entry detailed the date, time, and a description of the sounds. Night 1, drip, refrigerator hum, floorboard creak, distant clock chime. Night 2, faint rustle of leaves outside a window, distant muffled dog bark, soft sigh of wind through a chimney. Night 3, the rhythmic tick-tock of a wall clock, a faint, almost imperceptible hum of fluorescent lighting, the distant gurgle of pipes, started categorizing them. Kitchen sounds, living room sounds, bedroom sounds, hallway sounds. He noticed patterns. The kitchen sounds often included the drip, the refrigerator hum, sometimes the clink of ceramic on ceramic, as if a cup had been gently placed on a counter. The bedroom sounds were often the soft rustle of sheets, the faint creak of a bed frame, or the distant, almost ghostly sigh of someone shifting in their sleep, though he quickly dismissed the last as his imagination. These were empty rooms, he reminded himself. Always empty. The horror, he realized, wasn't in any overt threat. There were no voices, no footsteps approaching, no sudden crashes. It was far more insidious. It was the profound intimacy of it all. He was listening to the private, mundane existence of spaces that were meant to be silent, undisturbed. He was an uninvited guest, a silent eavesdropper on the very air of forgotten rooms. The violation was subtle, a creeping unease that settled deep in his bones. He felt like a voyeur, not of people, but of absence. He tried to identify the rooms. The kitchen with the leaky faucet became a recurring character in his nocturnal broadcasts. He imagined it, a small, perhaps slightly neglected kitchen. The faucet, a persistent punctuation mark in the quiet. He pictured the refrigerator, its hum a steady heartbeat in the dark. He could almost smell the faint, lingering scent of stale coffee or forgotten spices. He even tried to deduce the time of day in these unseen locations. The refrigerator hum was constant, but the leaky faucet only seemed to drip at certain times, suggesting perhaps fluctuating water pressure or a different time zone. He started cross-referencing, looking for consistency. The floorboard creak, for instance, often followed the faint sound of a door gently closing, suggesting a draft or the settling of an old house. One night, the sounds became more distinct, more specific. He heard the unmistakable click of a light switch, followed by the soft whir of a ceiling fan slowly starting up. Then the gentle, rhythmic whoosh of its blades cutting through the air. This was a living room, he thought, or perhaps a study. He could almost feel the cool air stirring. Another night, he heard the faint, metallic clang of a radiator, followed by the gentle hiss of steam. It was an old heating system, he deduced, perhaps in a building similar to his own. He imagined the warmth slowly spreading through a cold room, chasing away the chill of the night. The creeping sense of dread intensified. These weren't just generic sounds anymore. They were becoming portraits, intimate glimpses into the unseen architecture of other people's lives, or rather, the lives of their empty spaces. He felt a strange, almost perverse connection to these anonymous rooms. He was privy to their secrets, their quiet moments of being. He started to feel watched, even though he was the one doing the listening. The idea that these rooms, these empty spaces, might somehow be aware of his intrusion began to gnaw at him. He would sometimes switch off the radio mid-broadcast, unable to bear the weight of the silence it brought, the profound emptiness it revealed. But the compulsion to listen, to understand, always drew him back. Then came the night that shattered his carefully constructed detachment. It was a Tuesday, late autumn, the air outside crisp and still. The radio, as always, crackled to life at 3:17 a.m. The familiar hum, the introductory static. Alan lay rigid, listening, recorder already running. The first sound was a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. Not human, he knew, but the sound of an old house breathing. Then, a faint, high-pitched squeak. He frowned, trying to place it. It was a familiar sound, one that tugged at the edges of his memory, but he couldn't quite grasp it. The squeak repeated, a little louder this time, followed by a soft, rhythmic creak. Squeak, creak, squeak, creak. It was distinct, unmistakable. And then, the sound that froze the blood in his veins. The unmistakable, gentle clink of a small glass marble rolling across a wooden floor, followed by the soft thud as it hit something soft, like a rug. Alan sat bolt upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The squeak, the creak, the marble. He knew these sounds. He knew them intimately. The squeak was the sound of the old, slightly rusted spring in the bottom drawer of his childhood dresser. The creak was the loose floorboard directly in front of that dresser, the one he had jumped on countless times as a boy, trying to make it creak louder. And the marble was from the small, chipped glass collection he kept in a velvet pouch, hidden in that very same dresser drawer, his childhood bedroom, empty for over 20 years. His parents had passed away. The house sold to a young couple who had renovated it completely. There was no way those specific sounds could still exist. No way. Yet there they were, clear and distinct, broadcast directly into his silent room by the ancient radio on his bedside table. He could almost see the faded wallpaper, the single bed with its worn quilt, the dusty bookshelf. He could almost feel the cool air from the window. He always left slightly ajar. The sounds continued, a ghostly symphony of his past. The faint, almost musical hum of the old radiator, the one that always clanked when it first came on. The soft, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a loose window pane in a gentle breeze. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gripped the radio. It was warm to the touch, humming with an unseen energy. The amber light pulsed faintly, as if breathing. He stared at the dial, the names of forgotten cities blurring before his eyes. It wasn't tuning into other empty rooms. It was tuning into his empty rooms. Rooms that existed only in memory, or perhaps in some other impossible dimension. The profound intimacy he had felt before morphed into something far more terrifying. A violation of his most private, cherished memories. The radio wasn't just listening to empty spaces. It was listening to the echoes of his own life, broadcasting them back to him, distorted and disembodied. It was a profound, unsettling intrusion into the very fabric of his being. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't simply throw it away. It felt like discarding a part of himself, a conduit to something he couldn't comprehend. He couldn't keep listening. The thought of hearing more, of having his past laid bare by this silent, omniscient device, was unbearable. Slowly, carefully, Alan reached for the power switch. He flicked it off. The amber light extinguished instantly, plunging the room back into profound darkness. The hum ceased. The sounds of his childhood bedroom vanished, leaving only the familiar, comforting silence of his own apartment. He lay there for a long time, staring at the dark form of the radio on his bedside table. It was just an object, a piece of old technology, but it had shown him something impossible, something that defied logic and reason. It had shown him that even in the deepest silence, even in the most forgotten corners of time and space, there were echoes. And sometimes, those echoes could find a way to speak. Next morning, Alan carefully wrapped the radio in a thick velvet cloth, then placed it in a sturdy wooden box. He carried the box to the back of his closet, pushing it behind old coats and forgotten suitcases. He didn't throw it out. He couldn't. But he couldn't keep it out either. It was a secret, a profound, unsettling truth that he now carried within him. The dust on the dial, he realized, wasn't just physical. It was the dust of time, of memory, of things best left undisturbed. And sometimes, in the dead of night, even the dust could speak. Second story, the overnight audit. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, persistent thrum, a sound that after 3 nights had burrowed deep into Lena's skull, a constant companion in the vast, echoing silence of the corporate office. From 10 at night until 6 in the morning, she was a solitary island in an ocean of empty cubicles, her fingers dancing over the keyboard, inputting endless lines of data into a system that felt as ancient and unyielding as the building itself. This was her temporary kingdom, a 2-week assignment that promised a decent paycheck, but delivered an unsettling solitude. The building, a monolithic structure of glass and steel, stood sentinel over the sleeping city. Inside, it was a labyrinth of beige and gray, punctuated by the occasional potted plant that looked as weary as Lena felt by 4 a.m. Each night, she'd arrive, swipe her temporary badge, and the heavy glass doors would sigh shut behind her, sealing her within. The only sounds were the distant rumble of the city, the soft whir of the servers in a locked room down the hall, and the almost imperceptible hiss of the air conditioning. Sometimes, an elevator would chime softly, its doors sliding open to reveal an empty car, a phantom presence in the quiet. The scent of stale coffee, a ghost of the bustling workday, clung to the air, a reminder of the lives that inhabited these spaces during the sunlit hours. On her 3rd night, a Tuesday, the routine was as monotonous as ever. Rows upon rows of desks, each a miniature landscape of monitors, keyboards, and ergonomic chairs, stretched out before her. Most were meticulously clear, wiped clean by the unseen hands of the day's cleaning crew. But as Lena stretched, her eyes scanning the silent expanse, something snagged her attention. 3 rows over, on a desk that had been utterly bare the previous 2 nights, sat a coffee mug. It was a simple ceramic mug, a muted blue, with a faint, almost imperceptible chip near the rim. Nothing remarkable. Yet Lena paused. She distinctly remembered that desk. It was directly in her line of sight from her own temporary station, and she had noted its emptiness, its stark, impersonal surface, as she had all the others. She frowned, a tiny crease forming between her brows. Had she simply not noticed it before? Perhaps someone had left it behind, forgot, after a late meeting. It was plausible. She shrugged, dismissing the fleeting oddity, and returned to the relentless rhythm of her data entry. The numbers blurred, the hum of the lights intensified, and the mug, for a time, faded from her mind. The 4th night brought with it a subtle shift in the air, a colder current that seemed to whisper through the empty corridors. Lena arrived, her temporary badge feeling heavier in her hand than usual. The silence felt deeper, more watchful. She settled into her cubicle, the familiar click of her keyboard a small comfort. Before she began her work, her gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, to the blue coffee mug. It was still there, exactly where she remembered it. But then her eyes drifted to the desk next to it. This one, she recalled, had a small, framed photograph. A family portrait. A smiling man, a smiling woman, and a smiling boy, perhaps 10 or 11, standing in front of what looked like a sun-drenched beach. It had been a cheerful, innocuous detail in the otherwise sterile environment. Now the boy was frowning. It wasn't a dramatic, angry scowl. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible downturn of the lips, a slight furrowing of the brow. The kind of frown a child makes when told to stand still for too long, or when a wave has just splashed their feet unexpectedly. But it was undeniably a frown. Lena leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She remembered the boy's wide, toothy grin, the way his eyes had crinkled at the corners. She was sure of it. She had even thought, briefly, how happy they looked. Now, that happiness was gone, replaced by a faint, childish displeasure. A prickle of unease traced its way up her spine. This wasn't a forgotten coffee mug. This was a change, a deliberate, impossible change. She told herself it was the light, a trick of her tired eyes. She rubbed them, then looked again. The frown remained. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping faintly on the carpet, a sound that seemed to echo through the empty office. She walked over to the desk, her footsteps unnaturally loud. She picked up the frame. The photograph was a standard print, glossy and unremarkable. She turned it over, examined the back. Nothing. No hidden mechanism, no digital display. Just a simple photo. She placed it back down, carefully, precisely as it had been. The boy frowned up at her. Lena returned to her desk, her heart thudding a little faster than before. She tried to dismiss it again. Sleep deprivation, the monotony of the job, her mind playing tricks. But the image of the frowning boy clung to her thoughts, a tiny, insidious seed of doubt. The fluorescent hum seemed to take on a more sinister quality, a low, watchful drone. The next few nights became a quiet, internal audit of the office. Lena found herself spending less time focused on her data entry and more time observing. She started making mental notes. Then, cautiously, actual notes on a small pad she kept hidden beneath her keyboard. Night 5. The blue coffee mug was still there, but now, nestled beside it, was a small green stress ball, shaped like a miniature globe. She hadn't seen it before. The desk calendar on the same desk, previously showing a generic landscape, now displayed a cartoon drawing of a cat wearing glasses. A specific, quirky detail that felt too personal to be random. Night 6. The family photo remained, the boy still frowning. But on a different desk, one belonging to someone named M. Davies, according to the nameplate. A small, vibrant green plant, a succulent, had withered. Its once plump leaves were now shriveled and brown, as if neglected for weeks. Lena was certain it had been healthy and thriving just 2 nights prior. She remembered thinking how resilient it looked in the harsh office light. Now, it was dying. The changes were small, almost imperceptible to a casual glance. But to Lena, who was now scrutinizing every detail, they were glaring. They were like tiny cracks appearing in a perfectly smooth surface, hinting at something vast and unsettling beneath. The office, once a sterile, predictable environment, was becoming a canvas for subtle, disturbing alterations. She began to feel a strange, creeping dread. It wasn't the fear of a ghost or a monster. It was the fear of something far more insidious, the slow, methodical erosion of reality. It was the fear of being gaslighted by an inanimate building. She tried to find patterns. Did the changes relate to the person whose desk it was? She looked up M. Davies in the company directory, but her temporary access was limited. She could only see a name, no department, no contact information. The company was too large, too anonymous. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify with each passing night, a constant, low-frequency vibration that resonated in her bones. The soft chime of the empty elevator arriving felt less like a random occurrence and more like a deliberate announcement, a spectral butler ushering in unseen guests. The stale coffee scent, once merely unpleasant, now seemed to carry a hint of something else, something metallic and cold. On night 7, a framed certificate on a desk near the window, previously celebrating an Employee of the Month achievement from 2 years ago, now showed a different name, and the achievement was for outstanding attendance from last month. The font was identical, the frame the same. Only the content had shifted. It was as if the building was not just changing objects, but rewriting histories. Lena's sleep became fractured, haunted by images of shifting photographs and wilting plants. She'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced she'd forgotten to check a specific desk, or that a change had occurred while she was looking away. Her grip on her own sanity felt tenuous. Was she imagining it all? Was the isolation getting to her? She pinched herself hard. The pain was real. The changes were real. She started taking photos with her phone, shaky, poorly lit images of the desks before and after. The evidence, however, was flimsy. Without a time-stamped, high-quality camera, it could easily be dismissed as poor lighting or her own misremembering. She knew deep down that if she showed these to anyone, they would think she was losing her mind. The horror was in the subtlety. There were no grand, terrifying manifestations. No blood, no screams. Just a slow, methodical unraveling of the expected. The office was a silent, meticulous editor, revising the narratives of its inhabitants. And Lena was the only witness. She started to wonder about the people whose lives were being subtly altered. The man with the blue coffee mug and the stress ball. Had he suddenly developed a fondness for cats? Had his stress levels increased? The family with the frowning boy. Had their domestic bliss taken a turn? The person whose plant had died. Had their personal life withered alongside it? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The building wasn't just changing objects, it was reflecting, or perhaps causing, shifts in the very fabric of these people's existences. It was an overnight audit, not of data, but of lives. Her 2-week assignment loomed large in her mind. A ticking clock counting down to an unknown fate. She had only a few more nights. The initial relief of the job, the quiet solitude, had curdled into a suffocating dread. She was no longer just inputting data. She was an unwitting observer to a slow-motion, metaphysical crime. On night 9, she noticed a new detail. On the desk directly opposite hers, which had always been impeccably neat, a single, crumpled tissue now lay beside the keyboard. A small, insignificant detail, but she knew it hadn't been there before, and it felt personal, as if the building was starting to acknowledge her presence, to leave its subtle marks closer to her. She found herself whispering to the empty cubicles, a desperate attempt to break the silence, to assert her own reality. "What are you doing?" she'd murmur, her voice swallowed by the vastness. "Why are you doing this?" There was, of course, no answer. Only the persistent hum of the lights, the soft chime of the empty elevator, and the scent of stale coffee, now laced with something else, something she couldn't quite place, but which felt cold and metallic, like old pennies. Night 10, her penultimate night. The air was thick with a palpable tension. Lena felt like a mouse trapped in a maze, watched by an unseen, patient predator. She walked her nightly rounds, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom of the unlit sections of the office. The blue coffee mug now had a small, handwritten note tucked beneath it. Lena carefully pulled it out. The handwriting was neat, almost childlike. It read, "Don't forget the cat food." Her breath hitched. This was a direct, undeniable instruction. For someone. A mundane, everyday task, made terrifying by its impossible appearance. It wasn't just a change. It was an active insertion into a life. She hurried back to her desk, her hands trembling. Her eyes darted to her own temporary station. It was still the same. Her generic monitor, her borrowed keyboard, her small, hidden notepad. But for how long? The thought that had been gnawing at her, the one she had tried to suppress, now clawed its way to the forefront of her mind. What happened when her 2 weeks were up? When she left this silent, rewriting building? Would her desk, currently so impersonal, suddenly acquire a new detail? A coffee mug, perhaps, with a chip near the rim. A small, green stress ball. Would a family photo appear, featuring a smiling woman who, in time, would begin to frown? The idea was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. The building wasn't just auditing the lives of others. It was preparing for her. It was collecting data, observing her habits, waiting for her departure to begin its quiet, insidious work on her own narrative. She imagined another temp worker, just like her, arriving for the night shift, 2 weeks from now. They would sit at this very desk, her desk, and notice a small incongruity. A forgotten pen, perhaps, or a specific brand of hand lotion. And then, slowly, meticulously, the building would begin to rewrite her. Her hobbies, her relationships, her very memories. All subtly altered, adjusted, audited. The final hour of her shift dragged on. Each tick of the clock, a hammer blow against her dwindling composure. The data entry, once a mindless task, now felt like a desperate act of defiance. A way to anchor herself to something real, something tangible. As 6 a.m. approached, the first faint hint of dawn, a pale gray light, began to filter through the massive windows, chasing away the deepest shadows. The building, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the lights softened. The air conditioning seemed to sigh. Lena packed her bag, her movements stiff and deliberate. She glanced one last time at the desk with the blue coffee mug and the note. "Don't forget the cat food." The words seemed to mock her, a mundane instruction in a world gone subtly mad. She walked to the glass doors, her badge ready. The silence of the office pressed in on her, no longer a comfort, but a heavy, watchful presence. She swiped her card. The doors hissed open, revealing the waking city, a world of noise and light and reassuring chaos. She stepped out into the cool morning air and didn't look back. But as she walked away, the image of her own empty desk, waiting in the silent, watchful building, lingered in her mind. And she couldn't shake the chilling thought that perhaps, somewhere, a new coffee mug was already being placed, waiting for the next overnight audit. A mug, perhaps, with a small, almost imperceptible chip near the rim, and a faint, lingering scent of stale coffee. Third story, the unsound room. Vin, a university student perpetually on the hunt for a bargain, stumbled upon it almost by accident. The advertisement was terse, almost dismissive. Quaint apartment, old building, low rent. He expected a catch, a significant flaw that justified the suspiciously affordable price in a city where every square foot commanded a king's ransom. What he found was an architectural curiosity, nestled on the third floor of a pre-war brownstone, whose brick facade seemed to sigh with age. The apartment itself was a labyrinth of angles, a testament to a bygone era of haphazard renovations. Walls met at odd degrees, hallways veered unexpectedly, and the main living area, while spacious, felt like a collection of cleverly disguised corners. Yet, the rent was undeniably, shockingly low. His initial inspection revealed no obvious defects. The plumbing worked, the windows sealed, and the heating hummed with a surprising efficiency. The strangest feature was a small, almost forgotten spare bedroom tucked away at the very end of a narrow corridor. It was an afterthought, a space clearly carved out of what might have once been a large closet or a landing. Its dimensions were peculiar, a trapezoid rather than a rectangle, with one wall curving slightly inwards, as if the building itself had developed a subtle internal deformity. Still, it had a window, albeit one overlooking a grimy air shaft, and enough space for a modest desk and a single bed. Finn, a pragmatic soul, shrugged. A cheap apartment was a cheap apartment, and a spare room, no matter how oddly shaped, was a luxury he hadn't anticipated. He signed the lease that very afternoon, a faint tremor of disbelief still lingering in his hand. The first week was a blur of unpacking and settling in. Boxes were emptied, textbooks arranged, and the scent of old wood and fresh paint slowly gave way to the familiar aroma of instant coffee and ramen noodles. The spare room remained largely untouched, a repository for empty boxes and forgotten items. It was only when a particularly demanding essay deadline loomed that Finn considered it as a potential study sanctuary. His main living area, with its proximity to the street and the distant rumble of the city, was hardly conducive to deep concentration. The spare room, he reasoned, might offer a modicum of quiet. He dragged a small, rickety desk into the trapezoidal space, along with his laptop and a stack of dense philosophy texts. The air within the room felt different. He noticed a subtle shift in pressure, a peculiar stillness. He closed the door, a heavy, solid slab of wood that seemed to fit its frame with unusual precision. The moment the latch clicked, the world outside simply ceased to exist. It wasn't merely quiet. It was an absolute, profound silence that pressed in on his eardrums, a vacuum where sound had once been. He blinked, disoriented. The distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint murmur of traffic from the street below, the almost imperceptible creak of the old building settling, all of it gone. Intrigued, Finn conducted a series of impromptu experiments. He turned on his phone speaker, blasting a heavy metal track at full volume. The sound filled the small room, vibrating through the floorboards, assaulting his ears. He then opened the door a crack, just enough to peer into the hallway. From there, the music was completely inaudible. Not muffled, not faint, but utterly absent. It was as if the sound waves themselves were trapped within the room's confines, unable to escape. He closed the door, stepped back into the hallway, and yelled his roommate's name at the top of his lungs. No response. He opened the door again, and there was his roommate, calmly reading a book, oblivious to Finn's frantic shouts. "Did you hear me?" Finn asked, his voice echoing strangely in the suddenly unsilent hallway. His roommate looked up, startled. Hear what? The room, Finn realized, was an anomaly. Sounds made inside it did not leave, and sounds from outside could not get in. It was a perfect, impenetrable bubble of silence. At first, it was a novelty, a source of endless fascination. He spent hours in there, not just studying, but simply existing in the profound quiet. He would play music, loud and uninhibited, knowing it would disturb no one. He would talk to himself, testing the acoustics, listening to the pure, unadulterated sound of his own voice, untainted by echoes or external interference. The room became his sanctuary, a personal void where the clamor of the city and the demands of university life could not penetrate. It was, he thought, a truly remarkable find. But remarkable things, Finn would soon learn, often carry an unseen cost. The absolute silence of the room began, subtly at first, to alter his perception of sound when he left it. The world outside, once a familiar symphony of urban life, now seemed overwhelmingly loud, almost abrasive. The gentle hum of the refrigerator became a grating drone. The distant sirens, once mere background noise, now pierced his ears with an alarming intensity. Conversations in the hallway felt like shouts, and the simple act of walking across the wooden floorboards produced a thunderous creak that made him wince. His hearing, it seemed, had become acutely sensitive, almost painfully so. It was as if the prolonged exposure to perfect silence had recalibrated his auditory senses, making the ordinary cacophony of life unbearable. He found himself craving the quiet of the room, retreating into its soundless embrace whenever the outside world became too much. His friends noticed his increasingly withdrawn nature, his tendency to flinch at sudden noises. "You're getting jumpy, Finn," his roommate remarked one evening, after Finn had nearly dropped a plate at the sound of a dropped fork. Finn merely offered a weak smile, unable to articulate the strange, unsettling shift that was occurring within him. The room, his sanctuary, was slowly turning the rest of his world into a source of constant irritation and low-level dread. The silence, once a comfort, was now a silent, insidious wedge, separating him from the ordinary rhythms of existence. The true horror, however, began not with sound, but with absence. One late night, deep in the throes of a particularly challenging philosophy chapter, Finn leaned back in his chair, stretching his tired limbs. The heavy textbook, a weighty tome on existentialism, slipped from his lap and landed with a soft thud on the worn carpet. He sighed, a sound that seemed to vanish into the profound quiet of the room, and bent down to retrieve it. But just as his fingers brushed the cover, a sudden, inexplicable urge, a strange, almost compulsive impulse, seized him. He stood up, leaving the book where it lay, and walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the cold brass knob, then pulled the door shut with a soft click. The sound of the latch, usually so distinct, was swallowed whole by the room's peculiar properties. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the faint, almost forgotten sounds of the building, the distant rumble of the subway, the creak of pipes, the almost imperceptible hum of electricity. A strange sense of unease prickled at the back of his neck. Why had he done that? Why had he left the book? He shook his head, dismissing the fleeting oddity as a symptom of sleep deprivation. He opened the door a moment later, intending to retrieve the book, and finally put it away. The room was empty. His eyes scanned the floor where the book had fallen. Nothing. He checked under the desk, behind the small, single bed, even in the narrow space between the wall and the bookshelf. The book, a thick, dark blue volume with a distinctive gold-embossed title, was gone. It hadn't been there long, mere seconds, certainly not enough time for anyone to have entered or exited the room without his knowledge. The door had been firmly shut. A cold knot of fear began to tighten in his stomach. This wasn't merely soundproofing. This was something else entirely. He spent the rest of the night in a state of agitated disbelief, packing the apartment, returning to the empty room again and again, as if the sheer force of his will could conjure the missing textbook back into existence. It was illogical, impossible. Books didn't simply vanish. Yet, it had. The profound silence of the room, once a comforting embrace, now felt like a predatory stillness, a hungry void. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Finn began a series of deliberate, terrifying experiments. He started small. A pencil. He placed it carefully on the desk inside the room, closed the door, counted to 10, and opened it. The pencil was gone. He tried a coin, a small, shiny quarter. Same result. A crumpled piece of paper. A single sock. Each time, the object, left for mere seconds within the room's confines, simply ceased to be. The room wasn't just soundproof. It was slowly, insidiously erasing things left within it. The existential dread that had begun with his altered perception of sound now intensified into a crushing, suffocating fear. What was this room? What was it doing? He tried leaving objects for longer periods, for minutes, then hours. The results were consistent. Anything left inside the unsound room, as he had begun to call it, would disappear. There was no trace, no residue, no hint of where it had gone. It simply wasn't there anymore. He tried to rationalize it. A hidden compartment, a trick of light, but his logical mind, trained in the rigorous disciplines of university study, found no solace in such explanations. The disappearances were too clean, too absolute. There was no mechanism, no visible means by which these objects could be removed. It was as if the very fabric of reality within that small, trapezoidal space was different, operating under rules unknown and terrifying. The silence of the room, once a peaceful haven, now felt like a living entity, a vast, hungry emptiness that consumed not just sound, but matter itself. When he sat inside it, the profound quiet was no longer comforting. It was menacing, a silent roar that threatened to swallow him whole. He began to feel a strange, almost magnetic pull towards the room. A morbid curiosity mingled with a primal terror. He would stand in the hallway, staring at the closed door, his heart pounding, wondering what unseen process was at work within its walls. His sleep became fractured, haunted by nightmares of being trapped in an ever-shrinking void, of his own voice fading into nothingness, of his body slowly dissolving, piece by piece. He lost weight, his eyes grew hollow, and the dark circles beneath them spoke of sleepless nights spent contemplating the impossible. He considered telling his roommate, his friends, but the words felt absurd, nonsensical. My spare room eats things. Who would believe him? They would think he was losing his mind, succumbing to the pressures of university life. And perhaps, he feared, they would be right. The room was certainly doing something to his sanity. One evening, a desperate, chilling idea took root in his mind. He needed to understand. He needed to witness it. He found a small, cheap digital camera, set it to record video, and placed it on the desk inside the unsound room. He aimed it at a small, brightly colored rubber ball, which he placed directly in the center of the floor. His hands trembled as he pressed record, then quickly exited the room, pulling the door shut behind him. He waited, his breath held, for a full minute. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, he opened the door. The rubber ball was gone. He retrieved the camera, his fingers fumbling with the playback button. The video began, showing the empty room, the rubber ball sitting innocently on the floor. He fast-forwarded, his eyes glued to the screen. The ball remained, and then, at precisely the 47-second mark, it simply wasn't there. There was no flicker, no distortion, no visible movement. One frame, the ball was present. The next, it was gone. It was as if the pixels themselves had simply decided to omit it. The camera had recorded nothing, but a sudden, inexplicable void where the object had been. The revelation was more terrifying than any dramatic disappearance could have been. There was no mechanism, no force, no discernible action. The room didn't consume or destroy, it simply erased. It was a place where existence was conditional, where objects could be unmade, their very presence revoked. The implications were staggering, mind-numbing. If it could do this to a rubber ball, to book, to pencil, what else could it do? What if, one day, he himself lingered too long within its silent, hungry embrace? The thought became an obsession. He stopped using the room entirely, sealing it off as if it were a radioactive chamber. He taped the door shut, then added a chain and a padlock, a futile gesture against a force that defied physical laws. But the room, even when closed and locked, exerted a silent, psychological pressure. He could feel its presence, a cold, empty spot in the heart of his apartment, a constant reminder of the impossible. His perception of sound continued to warp. The outside world became a constant assault, a barrage of noise that grated on his nerves. He started wearing noise-canceling headphones even when he wasn't in the apartment, desperate for any semblance of the quiet he had once found so comforting. But the silence he sought was no longer peaceful. It was tainted by the memory of the unsound room, the terrifying void that had consumed his possessions and threatened his sanity. He began to notice other subtle changes in the apartment. Objects would occasionally seem out of place, or he would be unable to find something he was certain he had left in a particular spot. A misplaced key, a vanished pen, a book that seemed to have migrated shelves. He dismissed them as forgetfulness, the natural disarray of a busy student. But a chilling thought, a whisper of dread, began to insinuate itself into his mind. Was the room's influence spreading? Was its ability to unmake reality slowly seeping beyond its strange, trapezoidal confines? The building itself seemed to groan more loudly at night, its old timbers sighing with a deeper, more resonant melancholy. Shadows stretched longer, darker, in the odd angles of his apartment. He found himself avoiding the hallway that led to the unsound room, taking circuitous routes through his living space, as if proximity alone could draw him into its terrifying embrace. One morning, he woke with a start, a cold sweat clinging to his skin. He had dreamt of the room, but this time he wasn't outside looking in. He was inside, and the silence was absolute, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if they were slowly dissolving. And then, in the dream, he saw it. A faint, shimmering distortion in the air, a ripple in the fabric of the room itself, directly where his hand had been. He woke before he could see what happened next, but the terror lingered. A visceral, sickening certainty. The unsound room wasn't just erasing objects. It was a place where things simply ceased to be, without explanation, without trace. And Finn, living in its shadow, felt himself slowly being unmade by its silent, consuming presence. The cheap rent had seemed like a blessing, but it had come with a price far greater than any he could have imagined. A price measured not in money, but in sanity, in reality, and perhaps in existence itself. The silence, once a novelty, had become a predator, and Finn, a student of philosophy, was now living a terrifying existential question with no answer. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had to leave. But even as he contemplated escape, a new, more insidious fear took hold. What if, by then, a part of him had already been unmade? What if, when he finally stepped out into the noisy, vibrant world, a piece of Finn, a memory, a thought, a very part of his being, had already been silently consumed by the unsound room? The thought was more terrifying than any physical threat, for it suggested a disappearance far more profound and far more permanent. Fourth story, the second set of photographs. The dust motes danced in the lone shaft of sunlight, piercing the attic's gloom, tiny, swirling galaxies in miniature. Margaret coughed, the dry air scratching at her throat as she heaved another box of forgotten linens onto the growing stack. Her mother, bless her aging heart, was downstairs, attempting to categorize ancient cookie tins, a task that would likely take until supper. Margaret, meanwhile, was wrestling with the ghosts of 100 forgotten summers. The house, her childhood home, was a labyrinth of memories, each creaking floorboard and peeling wallpaper telling a silent story. But today, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb, slowly being dismantled, brick by dusty brick. Her mother, 78 and stubbornly independent, had finally conceded to moving into a smaller, more manageable bungalow. It was for the best, Margaret knew. But the process of sifting through decades of accumulated life felt like excavating a part of herself. Her hand brushed against something cool and leathery beneath a pile of mildewed canvases. A photo album. Not the familiar, worn family albums that usually graced the living room coffee table, but something older, heavier, its dark cover embossed with an intricate, almost unsettling floral pattern she didn't recognize. Curiosity, a serpent coiling in her gut, prompted her to pull it free. It was thick with dust, years of neglect clinging to its surface like a shroud. She blew on it, sending a small cloud of gray into the air, then opened it to the first page. The adhesive was brittle, the corners of the photographs curled, but the images themselves were surprisingly clear and utterly, breathtakingly wrong. The first picture was of an infant, swaddled in a pink blanket, eyes wide and curious, a tiny fist clutched to its chin. It was her. There was no doubt in her mind. The faint birthmark on her temple, the distinctive curve of her lips. It was undeniably her as a baby. But the setting, the crib, was different. The wallpaper behind it, a cheerful pattern of yellow ducks, not the pale blue and white stripes she remembered. And the hand holding her, a woman's hand, was slender, elegant, adorned with a silver ring she'd never seen her mother wear. A chill, thin and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, traced a path down her spine. She flipped the page, her fingers trembling slightly. More pictures. A toddler, perhaps 2 or 3, on a swing set. Again, it was her distinctive wavy brown hair, her wide, expressive eyes. But the swing set itself was painted a vibrant red, not the chipped green one from her childhood. And the house in the background, a sprawling, 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch, was alien. Their house had always been a modest ranch. A strange, dizzying sensation began to bloom in her chest. She continued to turn the pages, each photograph a fresh jolt of disorientation. Here she was, a little older, maybe 5 or 6, standing beside a boy, his arms slung casually around her shoulder. He was dark-haired, with a gap-toothed smile, a missing front tooth echoing her own childhood snaggletooth. A younger brother. She'd never had a brother. She was an only child. The boy in the pictures was a constant presence, a grinning shadow by her side through childhood. They were at a birthday party, blowing out candles on a cake. They were splashing in a kiddie pool in a sun-drenched backyard. They were dressed in matching superhero costumes, capes flapping in a playful breeze. He was undeniably her brother in this alternate reality, and in many of the photos, particularly those from her later childhood, there was a faint, almost invisible line on her left cheek, just beneath her eye. A scar, a thin, silvery mark that she had never, ever possessed. The pictures continued, charting a parallel life. Her first day of school, but a different school building. A red brick structure with tall, arched windows. A family vacation, not to the familiar beach house in North Carolina, but to a lakeside cabin nestled among towering pines. There was a different family car, a station wagon she'd never seen. Different pets, a scruffy terrier instead of their beloved golden retriever. And always, always the boy, her phantom brother, laughing, playing, growing up beside her. Her mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the familiar face with the utterly foreign context. It was her, unmistakably her, in every single frame. Yet it wasn't her life. The people, the places, the details, they were all wrong. But the expressions on her face in the photographs, the genuine joy, the occasional childish pout, the awkward teenage smiles, they felt so undeniably hers. She could almost feel the warmth of the sun on her skin in the lakeside photos, the thrill of the wind in her hair as she rode a bicycle down a different, tree-lined street. She reached the late teens, a high school graduation picture. There she was in a cap and gown, her hair longer, styled differently, but her eyes, those same hazel eyes, looking out at the future. Beside her stood the phantom brother, a tall, gangly young man now, his smile still familiar, still warm. And that scar, a faint but distinct line, was still there on her cheek. The last few pages were empty. Margaret closed the album, a tremor running through her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. What was this? A prank? A mistake? But who would go to such elaborate lengths? She descended the attic stairs, the album clutched tightly in her hands. Her mother was in the living room, humming softly as she meticulously wiped down a ceramic bird figurine. "Mom," Margaret said, her voice a little breathy, a little hoarse. Her mother looked up, her smile gentle. "Find anything interesting up there, dear." Margaret held out the album. "What is this?" Her mother took it, her brow furrowing slightly as she examined the cover. "Oh, that old thing. I think that belonged to your Aunt Carol. She was quite the photographer, always taking pictures of everyone." She flipped through a few pages, her gaze distant. "Yes, I remember these. Little Emily, wasn't it? Or maybe Sarah. Carol had so many nieces and nephews. It was hard to keep track." Margaret stared at her mother, her jaw slack. "Mom, no, this is me. This is me as a baby, as a child. Look." She pointed to a picture of her as a small girl, riding a red tricycle. "This is me." Her mother peered closer, then chuckled softly. "Oh, you're right. Look at that. So much like you. But it's not you, dear. Oh, I remember now. This is your cousin, Brenda, Carol's daughter. She looked so much like you when she was little, didn't she? Even had that little scar she got from falling off her bike." Margaret's stomach lurched. Brenda. She had a cousin, Brenda, who lived in California, whom she'd met only a handful of times at large family gatherings. Brenda was a decade older than her, with dark hair and blue eyes, nothing like her own hazel. And Brenda had never had a scar on her face. Margaret knew this with a certainty that bordered on a fever dream. "Mom," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "Look at the handwriting. Underneath the pictures. Who wrote this?" Her mother, still smiling faintly, turned to an inscription under a picture of the little girl, with the phantom brother. It read, in looping, familiar script, Margaret and Leo, summer '98. Her mother's smile faltered. Her eyes, usually so clear and bright, clouded with a momentary confusion. "Well, that's odd," she murmured. "It looks like my writing, doesn't it? But why would I write that for Brenda's album? And who's Leo?" She shook her head, a small, dismissive gesture. "Must have been a mistake. I must have been helping Carol label some of her photos, and I got muddled. You know how my memory is getting these days." She handed the album back to Margaret, a faint frown creasing her brow before she turned back to her ceramic bird. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, little blue jay. Margaret stood rooted to the spot, the album a leaden weight in her hands. Her mother's casual dismissal, her quick, almost too easy explanations, did nothing to soothe the frantic buzzing in Margaret's head. If anything, it amplified it. The handwriting was her mother's. Margaret knew her mother's precise, slightly slanted script as intimately as she knew her own name. And the names under the pictures, Margaret, Leo. These weren't random jottings. Over the next few days, the album became a constant companion, a heavy, unsettling presence in her life. She studied it in secret, poring over each image, searching for a clue, a logical explanation that would dispel the creeping dread. She found none. Instead, each viewing only deepened the unsettling feeling, the quiet horror that was beginning to blossom within her. The details in the photographs began to feel both achingly familiar and utterly alien. The small, chipped teacup on the kitchen counter in one picture. She felt as though she could reach out and touch its rough edge. The way the sunlight fell through the window onto the patterned rug in another. It evoked a sense of warmth and comfort, a memory that wasn't hers, yet felt so profoundly ingrained. It was as if two distinct sets of memories were warring for dominance in her mind. One real, one phantom, both intensely vivid. She started seeing the scar, not physically on her own face, but a phantom sensation, a ghost of a line just beneath her left eye. She would catch herself touching the spot, a nervous habit she hadn't had before. In the mornings, she would stare at her reflection, searching for any subtle difference, any tiny shift that might betray the truth. Her eyes, her nose, the curve of her jaw, they were all hers, the ones she had always known. Yet, looking at the photographs, she felt a profound disconnect, as if the person in the mirror was merely a copy, a poorly rendered imitation of someone else. Her mother's explanations, once so casually offered, now echoed in her mind with a chilling hollowness. Aunt Carol's album, Little Brenda Muddled Memory. It was too convenient, too easily dismissed. Her mother had always been sharp, her memory for family details almost photographic. And the handwriting, it was undeniable. It was her mother's. Margaret began to watch her mother, subtly, surreptitiously. She noticed small things. A fleeting look of confusion on her mother's face when Margaret mentioned a childhood anecdote. A slight hesitation before answering a question about a distant relative. It was nothing concrete, nothing she could point to and say, "There, that's it." But it added to the growing sense of unease, a silent, unacknowledged tension in the house. She found herself Googling, searching for families with similar names, for houses that matched the one in the photographs, for any record of a Leo, born around her supposed birth year who might have shared her surname. She found nothing, of course. The internet, that vast ocean of information, offered no solace, no explanation for this impossible album. The horror wasn't the dramatic, jump scare kind. It was a slow, insidious erosion of her very being. Her sense of self, once so solid and rooted, was beginning to crumble like an old brick wall. Who was she? Was she Margaret, the only child, raised in a modest ranch house, without a scar and without a phantom brother? Or was she Margaret, the girl in the photographs, with a different family, a different home, and a lifelong companion named Leo? The chilling possibility began to solidify in her mind. What if both were true? What if there were two versions of her life, two parallel paths, and she had somehow ended up on the wrong one? The thought was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It wasn't just a matter of different circumstances. It implied a fundamental shift in her identity, a displacement from a life that was perhaps meant to be hers. One rainy afternoon, as her mother napped, Margaret ventured back into the attic. The air was heavy, dust motes still dancing in the dim light. She searched methodically, meticulously, through every box, every forgotten corner. She wasn't sure what she was looking for: another album, a letter, anything that might shed light on this impossible mystery. She found nothing else that directly referenced the photographs. But in a small, unmarked wooden box tucked away behind a stack of old yearbooks, she found a collection of old newspaper clippings. Most were mundane local news, classifieds. But one, yellowed with age, caught her eye. It was a small article, barely a paragraph, from a local paper, dated nearly 30 years ago. It reported on a minor car accident on a rural road outside of town. A family, a mother and two young children, had been involved. The mother and son had sustained minor injuries. The daughter, a girl named Margaret, had suffered a head injury and was in critical condition. The surname, clearly visible, was not hers. It was the surname of the family in the photographs, the Phantom family. Margaret's breath hitched, her vision blurred. The newspaper article felt impossibly cold in her shaking hands. A head injury, critical condition. The implications slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. What if that was the pivot point? The moment when the two realities diverged. She remembered vague, fragmented snippets from her childhood, things her mother had dismissed as childish nightmares or overactive imagination. A recurring dream of a different house, a different room, a red swing set. The fleeting sensation of a phantom hand in hers, a warm, reassuring presence that would vanish upon waking. She had always dismissed them as the fanciful ramblings of a child. Now, they felt like echoes, whispers from a life she had almost lived. The silence in the attic pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. The dust motes, once dancing galaxies, now seemed like falling ash, the debris of a shattered reality. Her sense of self, already fractured, felt like it was dissolving, molecule by molecule. She was not Margaret. Or rather, she was a Margaret, but not the one she thought she was. The scar, the head injury. Was it possible that the scar in the photographs was a remnant of that accident? A tangible mark of the life she had been living before what? Before she woke up in this one. She imagined it, a vivid, horrifying tableau. A car crash, the screech of tires, the shatter of glass. And then, a moment of unknowing, a void, before she opened her eyes in a different reality, in a different house, with a different mother. A mother who, perhaps, had always wanted an only child, a daughter she could truly call her own. The thought was monstrous, a betrayal of everything she had ever believed. Her mother, her loving, gentle mother, complicit in this elaborate deception. But why? And how? The questions swirled, unanswerable, leaving her feeling dizzy and nauseous. She crept back downstairs, the newspaper clipping tucked inside the photo album. Her mother was awake now, watching television, a contented sigh escaping her lips. Margaret looked at her, truly looked at her, searching for something. A flicker of guilt, a shadow of recognition. But there was only the familiar warmth in her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile. "Rough day?" her mother asked, patting the cushion beside her. Margaret sank onto the sofa, the album hidden beneath her arm. "Just tired, Mom." She tried to imagine her mother, the woman who had tucked her in at night, who had nursed her through childhood illnesses, who had celebrated every one of her triumphs, actively participating in such a profound deception. It felt impossible, a cruel twist of logic. Yet, the evidence, however unsettling, was there. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet paranoia. Margaret found herself scrutinizing every old photograph in their known family albums, searching for discrepancies, for hidden clues, for anything that might confirm or deny the terrifying narrative she was constructing. Each familiar face, each cherished memory, now felt tainted by a subtle undercurrent of doubt. She visited her Aunt Carol, the supposed owner of the album. Aunt Carol, frail and forgetful, could offer no coherent explanation. She remembered a photo album vaguely, but couldn't recall specific details or who the children in it were. Her memory was truly failing, a convenient shield against the truth, or perhaps a genuine reflection of her declining faculties. Margaret left more confused than before. The house, once a comforting haven, now felt like a stage set, meticulously crafted to maintain a lie. Each possession, each piece of furniture, each photograph on the wall seemed to whisper of a manufactured existence. She walked through the familiar rooms, touching objects that had always felt like extensions of her own history, and now felt like props in a play. The terror wasn't of monsters in the dark, or of shadowy figures lurking in corners. It was the terror of unreality, of a profound and irreparable schism within her own identity. She looked at her hands, her familiar hands, and wondered if they were truly hers, or if they belonged to the Margaret with the scar, the Margaret who grew up with Leo. Sleep became a battleground. She would drift off only to be jolted awake by vivid, unsettling dreams. Dreams of a different childhood bedroom, the wallpaper patterned with yellow ducks. Dreams of a boy with a gap-toothed smile, his laughter echoing in her ears. Dreams of a faint line on her cheek, a scar that pulsed with a phantom ache. She started seeing Leo everywhere. A fleeting glimpse of a dark-haired boy in a supermarket, a familiar silhouette disappearing around a corner. She knew it was her imagination, a cruel trick of her unraveling mind. But the visions persisted. Phantom limbs, of a lost reality. The move date loomed, a final, irreversible step. Her mother, oblivious to Margaret's inner turmoil, bustled around, packing the last of the trinkets, humming cheerful tunes. Margaret helped, her movements robotic, her mind consumed by the relentless loop of questions. On the last day, as the movers carried out the final boxes, Margaret stood in the empty living room, the echoes of a life she wasn't sure was hers reverberating around her. The bare walls, stripped of their comforting photographs, seemed to mock her, offering no answers, only vast, empty spaces. She held the album tightly, its smooth cover cool against her palms. The newspaper clipping was still inside. She could burn it, destroy the evidence, and try to forget. She could try to believe her mother's dismissals, to re-cement the fragile pieces of her identity. But how could she? The images were burned into her mind, the phantom memories too vivid, too real. The terror wasn't in knowing her life was a lie, but in the chilling, inescapable possibility that two versions of her life had happened, and that she was, irrevocably, in the wrong one, and the chilling thought that perhaps, somewhere, the other Margaret, the one with the scar and the brother, was also having dreams, fragmented visions of a life she had never lived, a life without a scar, a life she now inhabited, unknowingly. The car accident, the head injury, was it a trade, a transference? Had one Margaret died, and another, the one from the alternative reality, somehow taken her place, waking up in a life that wasn't hers, with memories that didn't belong to her? The new house was smaller, brighter, filled with the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. But for Margaret, it felt like an extension of the same elaborate stage play. She unpacked her boxes, meticulously arranging her belongings, each action feeling hollow, devoid of true purpose. She was playing a role, living a life that felt borrowed, a costume she wore for an audience she couldn't see. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and the world outside was asleep, Margaret would feel a faint, tingling sensation on her left cheek, just beneath her eye. And she would wonder, with a bone-deep chill, which Margaret was truly awake. Fifth story, the keeper of the wrong sky. Ronan had known the sea for longer than he'd known himself, or so it felt. For 30 years, the rhythmic thrum of the lighthouse generator had been the heartbeat of his existence, the salty tang of the air his constant companion, and the vast, inky canvas of the night sky his most cherished book. He was the keeper of the Kestrel Point light, a solitary sentinel perched on a craggy, wind-battered island that rose like a jagged tooth from the churning Atlantic. His routine was his anchor, a meticulously charted course through the days and nights. Each task a familiar comfort, each observation a confirmation of the universe's unwavering order. He knew the stars as intimately as a shepherd knew his flock. Polaris, steadfast and true, guided his gaze. Orion, the celestial hunter, strode across the winter heavens. The Pleiades, a shimmering cluster of distant sisters, twinkled with a delicate, almost fragile beauty. He had charted their paths, memorized their positions, and understood their silent, ancient language. The constellations were not mere patterns. They were old friends, reliable companions in his profound solitude. It was a perfectly clear night. one of those rare, crystalline evenings in late autumn when the air was so sharp it seemed to hum, and the stars blazed with an almost painful intensity. Ronan, a man of habit and precision, was making his nightly rounds, a thermos of lukewarm tea in one hand, his well-worn brass telescope in the other. He had just finished polishing the great Fresnel lens, its facets now gleaming like a giant, many-eyed jewel, ready to cast its sweeping beam across the dark waters. He set up his telescope on the small, wind-sheltered platform just outside the lantern room, orienting it with practiced ease. His target tonight was Lyra, the harp, a modest but elegant constellation, home to Vega, one of the brightest stars in the northern sky. He found it quickly, its familiar parallelogram shape a comforting sight. He adjusted the focus, bringing Vega into sharp relief, a brilliant diamond against velvet. Then his gaze drifted to the other stars forming the constellation. Delta Lyrae, Gamma Lyrae, Epsilon Lyrae, the double-double star, always a fascinating spectacle. As his eye traversed the familiar pattern, a subtle tremor, like a discordant note in a perfect symphony, ran through him. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. He recentered the telescope, checked his charts, even rubbed his eyes, convinced it was an optical illusion, a trick of the atmosphere, or perhaps just fatigue. Yet, the anomaly persisted. One of the stars, a faint but definite point of light that should have completed the upper left corner of the parallelogram, was simply not there. It was gone, not obscured by cloud, not dimmed by haze, but absent. The space where it should have been was just more blackness. Ronan, a man whose life was built on empirical evidence and logical deduction, felt a prickle of unease. He consulted his star charts, cross-referencing the coordinates. Beta Lyrae, a variable star, was known for its fluctuations, but this was different. This was an outright void. He dismissed it, as he had initially intended. Perhaps a passing satellite had briefly obscured it, or a momentary atmospheric distortion had created a blind spot. He made a mental note, a fleeting curiosity, and moved on to check the beacon, ensuring its rhythmic pulse was steady and true. The sea was calm, the light swept its arc, and the world, despite that tiny, unsettling void, seemed to continue as it always had. He retired to his small, Spartan quarters below the lantern room, the anomaly already fading into the background of his mind, attributed to an unusual, yet ultimately harmless, atmospheric trick. The next night, the wind had picked up, howling around the lighthouse like a hungry beast. Rain lashed against the thick glass of the lantern room, blurring the distant horizon. It was not an ideal night for stargazing, but Ronan, ever diligent, felt an inexplicable pull to the sky. He had a nagging feeling, a whisper of unease that had lingered since the previous night's observation. He knew it was irrational, but his meticulous nature demanded a second look. He waited until a brief lull in the storm, a fleeting moment when the clouds parted just enough to reveal a sliver of the heavens. He aimed his telescope, not at Lyra this time, but at Ursa Major, the Great Bear, a constellation so prominent it felt like a permanent fixture in the sky. He found its familiar dipper shape, the 7 bright stars that formed its iconic outline. He scanned from Alcate to Mizar and Alker, then down to Alioth, Megrez, Fecta, and Merak. All were there, shining through the thin veil of clouds. But then he looked for Dubba, the star that marked the top outer edge of the Dipper, one of the two pointer stars that led the eye directly to Polaris. His breath hitched again. It was gone. Not dimmed, not obscured, but utterly, irrevocably absent. The space where Dubhe should have burned, a beacon he had known since childhood, was empty. A gaping, silent hole in the fabric of the familiar. This was no atmospheric trick. This was no satellite. This was impossible. Ronan, a man of science and order, felt a cold dread begin to coil in his stomach. He moved with a speed uncharacteristic of his usual measured pace, fumbling for his logbook, a thick, leather-bound volume where he meticulously recorded every detail of his shifts, weather conditions, equipment checks, passing vessels, even unusual bird migrations. He opened it to a fresh page, his hand trembling slightly as he uncapped his pen. His initial entry was precise, almost clinical. Date, October 27th, 20XX. Time, 02:17 GMT. Observation. Star previously identified as Dubhe Alpha Ursae Majoris, located at Ra 11H3M 43.5s, deck plus 61 degrees 4503, is no longer visible. No atmospheric interference or cloud cover at time of observation in this specific celestial region. Confirmed absence with multiple telescopic adjustments and naked eye verification during brief cloud break. Previous anomaly. Recall of similar disappearance of a star within Lyra constellation. Unidentified, faint component. On October 26th, 01:55 GMT. Initial assessment attributed to atmospheric distortion. Re-evaluation suggests potential correlation, he wrote with a detached professionalism, as if documenting a minor equipment malfunction. But beneath the calm facade, a frantic current of disbelief churned. Stars did not simply vanish. They were ancient, immutable, burning furnaces of light that had existed for billions of years. Their disappearance defied every law of physics, every principle of astronomy he had ever known. He spent the rest of the night in a state of agitated vigilance, peering through the rain-streaked glass, his gaze drawn compulsively to the section of sky where Dubhe had once been. The void felt like a bruise on the night, a silent accusation. The days that followed blurred into a tense, agonizing vigil. Ronan abandoned his usual sleep schedule, driven by a desperate need to observe, to confirm, to understand. He would spend hours in the lantern room, his telescope his only companion, scanning the heavens with a desperate intensity. His logbook, once a record of mundane routine, became a chronicle of cosmic unraveling. October 28th, 03:01 GMT. Observed absence of Alcor 80 Ursae Majoris, the companion star to Mizar. The binary system now appears as a solitary point. This further confirms the pattern of disappearance within Ursa Major. October 29th, 00:45 GMT. Procyon Alpha Canis Minoris is gone. The lesser dog now consists only of Gomesa. The sky feels thinner. October 30th, 01:10 GMT. Sirius Alpha Canis Majoris, the brightest star in the night sky, is extinguished. Its absence leaves a profound, unsettling darkness in the winter constellation. The light from other stars seems to have dimmed, or perhaps it is my perception. His entries, initially dry and factual, began to betray the mounting terror. He started adding personal notes, raw and unfiltered, scribbled in the margins, sometimes almost illegible. This is not right. This is profoundly, terribly wrong. The patterns are breaking. The sky is bleeding. I checked my instruments, calibrated them, recalibrated them. They are functioning perfectly. It is the stars themselves. Am I losing my mind? Is this isolation finally breaking me? No, I see it. I see the voids. I see the blackness where light should be. He tried to find a pattern, a logic to the disappearances. Was it distance, brightness, constellation? There was none. The stars vanished seemingly at random, plucked from different corners of the celestial sphere, leaving behind only an echoing emptiness. It was like watching a grand tapestry slowly unweave itself, thread by precious thread, with no discernible design. The silence of the lighthouse, once a comforting balm, became oppressive. The rhythmic sweep of the light, once a symbol of order, now felt like a desperate, futile gesture against an encroaching, universal darkness. He stopped eating properly, subsisting on stale biscuits and lukewarm tea. Sleep offered no respite, haunted by dreams of a sky devoid of light, a vast, cold abyss. One evening, as he watched the familiar arc of the Milky Way, a gasp escaped him. A section of the galactic band, a shimmering river of countless distant suns, appeared to have faded, as if a cosmic eraser had swept across it. It wasn't just individual stars now. It was entire swaths of light, entire nebulae, entire distant galaxies, simply winking out of existence. The horror was no longer a cold dread. It was a vast, suffocating terror. It was not a monster lurking in the shadows, not a physical threat he could fight or flee. This was something far more profound, far more devastating. The universe itself was quietly, inexplicably, fraying at the edges. The very foundations of existence were dissolving, and he, Ronan, the solitary keeper of a small light on a forgotten rock, was the sole, helpless witness. He tried to contact the mainland. His radio, usually a lifeline, crackled with static, refusing to connect. He tried the emergency satellite phone, but it too remained stubbornly silent, as if the very airwaves had been severed, or perhaps as if there was no one left to answer. He was utterly alone, marooned not just on an island, but in a universe that was slowly, silently dying around him. The lighthouse beam continued its sweep, a defiant, yet increasingly pathetic, gesture against the encroaching darkness. He would watch it cut through the night, illuminating the churning waves, then disappear into the void where stars once shone. The irony was a cruel joke. He was a keeper of light, yet the ultimate source of light, the very stars themselves, were being stolen away. His logbook entries became more desperate, more philosophical. November 5th, 04:22 GMT. The constellation of Cassiopeia is now incomplete. Only 3 stars remain. Its familiar W shape is broken, a jagged, meaningless line. What does it mean when the ancient patterns cease to hold? What does it mean when the sky itself is a lie? November 7th, 0200 GMT. The light from the remaining stars feels different, colder, more distant, as if they are struggling to pierce through an unseen veil. Or perhaps, as if their light is no longer meant for this place. November 9th, 0000 GMT. I saw it. A star, a bright one in the constellation of Cygnus. Deneb. It flickered. Not like a variable star, not like a distant shimmer. It flickered like a dying flame. And then it was gone, just like that. A blink, a void. Ronan began to feel a profound sense of unreality. The world around him, the familiar walls of the lighthouse, the crashing waves, the scent of salt and damp stone, all seemed less solid, less real. It was as if the disappearance of the stars was not just an external phenomenon, but an internal one, eroding the very structure of his perception. He would stand at the top of the lighthouse, his face pressed against the cold glass, staring out at the ocean, then up at the increasingly barren sky. The sea remained, a vast, indifferent expanse of gray and black. But the sky was becoming a stranger. It was the wrong sky. A sky that had forgotten its purpose, that had lost its memory of light. He often wondered if anyone else, anywhere else, was witnessing this cosmic catastrophe. Were there other keepers, other astronomers, other lonely souls staring up at the same unraveling tapestry? Or was he truly the only one, trapped in this isolated vigil, condemned to watch the universe slowly extinguish itself? The thought was almost unbearable. To be the sole witness to such a vast, silent annihilation was a burden beyond measure. He tried to maintain his routine, to polish the lens, to check the generator, to sweep the floors. But his movements were slower, his mind elsewhere, consumed by the silent horror above. He found himself talking to the stars that remained, whispering questions into the vast emptiness. Why? What is happening? Where are you going? The only answer was the relentless howl of the wind and the mournful cry of the gulls. The nights grew darker, not just metaphorically, but literally. The cumulative effect of so many vanished suns was palpable. The residual glow from the remaining stars was insufficient to truly illuminate the landscape. The island, once bathed in the soft, ethereal light of a million distant fires, was now shrouded in a deeper, more profound gloom. The lighthouse beam, once a guiding light, now felt like a desperate, solitary scream into an ever-expanding void. One morning, as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Ronan looked up. The sun was rising, a familiar, comforting presence. But even its light seemed muted, a tired, weary glow. He wondered, with a chilling certainty, if one day he would look up and find even the sun gone, swallowed by the same inexplicable hunger that consumed the distant stars. He picked up his logbook, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. He wrote his final entry, not with the meticulous precision of a scientist, but with the raw, desperate clarity of a man facing the end of everything he knew. November 12th, 06:15 GMT. The sky is almost entirely bare now. Orion is a ghost, the Big Dipper a broken handle. Only a few scattered points of light remain, clinging to existence like desperate embers. The universe is not ending with a bang. but with a whisper. A quiet, terrifying fade into nothingness. I am here. I see it. I see the wrong sky. And there is nothing I can do. He closed the logbook, the leather cover feeling heavy in his hands. He walked to the lantern room, the great lens casting its lonely beam into the pre-dawn gloom. The sea stretched out before him, vast and indifferent. Above, the sky was a canvas of deepening black, punctuated by the few defiant pinpricks of light that stubbornly remained. He was the keeper of a light that shone into an emptiness, a witness to a cosmic silence that would forever haunt the edges of his sanity. And as the sun finally cleared the horizon, casting its pale, uncertain light across the desolate island, Ronan knew, with a chilling certainty, that the true darkness had only just begun. I hope this story provides the eerie atmosphere you're looking for. I've aimed for the requested length, tone, and style, focusing on Ronan's meticulous nature and the cosmic horror of the unraveling sky. Sixth story, The Dream Collector. The first time I met Kai, it was at a small, dimly lit art gallery opening. He was leaning against a wall, observing a particularly abstract piece with an intensity that drew me in. His eyes, a deep, shifting hazel, seemed to hold 1,000 secrets, and his smile, when he finally turned it on me, was both warm and utterly captivating. He spoke with a voice that was like aged velvet, smooth and comforting. And from that moment, I found myself inexplicably drawn to him. Our courtship was a whirlwind of late-night conversations, shared laughter, and a profound sense of understanding that I had never experienced with anyone before. Kai was attentive, insightful, and possessed a quiet charm that made every moment spent with him feel precious. He seemed to anticipate my thoughts, finish my sentences, and his presence was a balm to my often anxious mind. I was, for the first time in a long time, truly happy. It was a few weeks into our relationship when he first mentioned his peculiar ability. I had woken up in a cold sweat, shaken by a recurring nightmare that had plagued me since childhood. A shadowy figure lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, always out of reach, always threatening. I recounted it to him over breakfast, my voice still trembling slightly. He listened intently, his gaze unwavering, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "I can take it from you, Esther," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to resonate deep within me. "Your nightmares, I can collect them." I laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound. "What do you mean, collect them?" "Like put them in a jar." He chuckled, a rich, warm sound. "Something like that. Tell me every detail. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of fear. Don't hold back." Skeptical but desperate for relief, I did. I described the inky blackness, the suffocating presence, the cold dread that seeped into my bones. I recounted the feeling of being pursued, the frantic, soundless screams caught in my throat. I left nothing out, pouring out the terror that had clung to me for so long. As I spoke, Kai simply watched me, his eyes seeming to deepen, to absorb every word, every nuance of my fear. When I finished, a strange sense of lightness settled over me. It was as if a heavy cloak had been lifted from my shoulders. "There," he said softly, reaching across the table to take my hand. His touch was cool, reassuring. "It's gone now." And it was. That night, I slept soundly, deeply, for the first time in years. The shadowy figure did not appear, The cold dread did not return. The recurring nightmare, which had been a constant companion, simply vanished. I woke feeling refreshed, invigorated, and utterly amazed. Kai, my charming, enigmatic Kai, had truly taken it. Over the next few weeks, I tested his gift. A dream about falling endlessly, a vivid scenario of being lost in a labyrinth, a chilling vision of teeth gnashing in the dark. Each time, I would recount the dream to Kai in painstaking detail, and each time, the nightmare would disappear from my sleep, never to return. My nights became a sanctuary, a peaceful void free from the terrors that had once haunted me. My sleep improved dramatically, and with it, my overall well-being. I felt rested, calm, and incredibly grateful for Kai's unique ability. He was, truly, a dream come true. But as the weeks stretched into months, a subtle shift began to occur. It was so gradual, so insidious, that at first I barely noticed it. It started with my art. I had always been a painter, vibrant and expressive, my canvases bursting with color and emotion. Lately, however, the inspiration seemed to wane. My brushstrokes became hesitant. The colors I chose muted, almost bland. The passionate fire that once fueled my creativity seemed to flicker, then dim. I attributed it to stress, to the natural ebbs and flows of artistic temperament. Then came the emotional changes. I found myself less prone to the soaring highs of joy or the crushing lows of sorrow. Life, which had once felt like a vibrant tapestry, woven with threads of intense feeling, began to flatten out. The sharp edges of elation and despair softened, blurring into a placid, almost indistinguishable gray. A funny joke would elicit a polite smile rather than a hearty laugh. A sad movie would bring a gentle sigh instead of tears. It wasn't that I felt nothing. It was more like the volume had been turned down on my emotions, leaving them muffled and distant. My friends noticed it too, though they couldn't quite articulate what was different. "You seem calmer, Esther," one said, her brow furrowed in concern. Another commented, "You've been so quiet lately." "Everything all right?" I would nod, offer a vague reassurance, and then retreat into myself, unable to explain the growing sense of emptiness that was beginning to settle in my core. It was like a slow, quiet erosion, a gentle washing away of the vibrant hues of my inner world. Meanwhile, Kai seemed to flourish. He became more vibrant, more energetic, his eyes brighter than ever. There was a new spark in his gaze, a heightened intensity in his movements. He seemed to hum with an almost unnatural vitality, as if he were constantly plugged into some invisible power source. His conversations became more animated, his laughter more frequent, and his presence, once a soothing balm, now felt almost overwhelming in its sheer force. He was a supernova, and I, it seemed, was slowly becoming a black hole. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, I found myself observing him with a detached curiosity. His skin seemed to glow. His hair, usually a dark brown, appeared to shimmer with subtle streaks of gold. He was talking animatedly about a new project at work, his hands gesturing expressively, his face alight with enthusiasm. I listened, nodded, and felt nothing. No shared excitement, no genuine interest, just a dull, flat acceptance of his words. A chilling thought, cold and sharp, pierced through the muted fog of my mind. He takes my nightmares. He takes my fears. What if he isn't just taking the bad dreams? What if he's taking the essence of those fears, the raw, potent energy that fuels them? And what if, in doing so, he's also taking something else, something vital? The idea was absurd, fantastical, yet it resonated with a terrifying logic. My nightmares, after all, were not just images. They were deeply rooted fears, anxieties, unresolved emotions. They were a part of me, a dark reflection of my inner landscape. If he could simply collect them, what was he doing with them? Where did they go? And why did his vibrancy seem to grow in direct proportion to my own fatting? I started to pay closer attention. When I told him about a dream, even a mundane, slightly unsettling one that wasn't a full-blown nightmare, I would feel that familiar sense of lightness, that immediate relief. But afterward, a small part of me would feel less. A tiny flicker of an emotion, a fleeting memory, a subtle nuance of my personality would seem to vanish. It was imperceptible at first, like losing a single grain of sand from a vast beach. But over time, the beach was noticeably shrinking. My once vivid imagination, which had been a wellspring of stories and ideas, now felt barren. My quick wit, once a source of playful banter, had dulled. Even my memories seemed to lose their emotional resonance. I could recall events, facts, conversations, but the feelings associated with them, the joy of a first kiss, the sting of a past heartbreak, the thrill of a new adventure, were muted, like old photographs bleached by the sun. I tried to talk to him about it, cautiously at first. Kai, I began one morning, watching him sip his coffee, his eyes sparkling with an almost unsettling cheerfulness. Do you ever feel different after you take a dream? Like, does it affect you at all? He paused, his smile unwavering. Only in the best way, my dear. I absorb them. I transmute them. It's a cleansing for both of us. He reached for my hand, his grip firm, warm. You're sleeping so much better, aren't you? You're free from those horrors. His words were comforting, logical, yet they did nothing to quell the growing unease within me. His explanation felt incomplete. A cleansing, he said. But what was he cleansing me of, exactly? And what was he gaining in return? I began to withhold dreams. Small ones at first. A strange, nonsensical sequence that wasn't frightening, but simply odd. I wouldn't tell him about them. And to my surprise, the next night, a variation of that dream would return, sometimes slightly more vivid, sometimes with a faint echo of the emotion I had felt. It was a terrifying revelation. The dreams weren't just disappearing, they were being actively suppressed, or perhaps actively consumed. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just collecting nightmares. He was collecting my very essence. My fears, yes, but also the passions that gave rise to them. The intensity of my joy, the depth of my sorrow, the fire of my creativity. These were all intertwined with the capacity for fear, for vulnerability. By taking the dark, he was also taking the light. He was siphoning off the very things that made me me. My internal world, once a vibrant, tumultuous ocean, was becoming a still, shallow pond. The ripples of emotion were gone, replaced by a flat, unmoving surface. I looked at my paintings, now devoid of their former life, and felt a profound, chilling emptiness. The colors were there, the shapes were there, but the soul, the spark, was gone. I started to feel like a ghost in my own life, moving through the days with a sense of detachment, observing myself from a distance. My conversations became perfunctory, my interactions hollow. I could mimic enthusiasm, feign interest, but inside, there was a vast, echoing void. Kai, meanwhile, continued to radiate an almost blinding energy. He was more charming, more charismatic, more intensely alive than ever before. He seemed to feed on my diminishing light, growing stronger as I grew weaker. His eyes, once merely captivating, now held a predatory gleam that I hadn't noticed before, a hunger that was both subtle and terrifying. The last dream I had, before the silence truly descended, was not a nightmare in the traditional sense. It was a dream of a vast, empty landscape under a pale, indifferent sky. There was no color, no sound, no movement, just an endless, featureless expanse, and in the center, a solitary figure, small and fatting, slowly dissolving into the gray. It was me. I woke with a gasp, not of fear, but of profound, desolate understanding. I didn't tell Kai about that dream. I couldn't, because I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I did, the last vestiges of myself would simply vanish. Now I exist in a state of perpetual calm. My days are peaceful, my nights undisturbed. I sleep soundly, deeply, free from any unsettling visions. Kai is still here, still charming, still vibrant, still radiating that intense, almost overwhelming energy. He smiles at me, his eyes bright, and I smile back, a placid, empty smile. There are no more highs, no more lows, no more fear, but also no more joy. No more passion, no more longing, just a quiet, pervasive emptiness. He collected my nightmares, yes, but he also collected everything else. And now, I am merely a vessel, a perfectly calm, perfectly empty vessel, floating aimlessly on a placid, gray sea. And Kai, my beautiful, enigmatic Kai, thrives on the silence. 7th story. The static figure on Finch Street. Ben had always considered himself a creature of habit, content with the predictable rhythm of his days. But boredom, that insidious serpent, had begun to coil around him ever since he'd moved into the quiet suburb of Meadowbrook. His new house on Finch Street was a picture of suburban normalcy. A tidy lawn, a 2-car garage, and a friendly, if somewhat reserved, neighborhood. One particularly uneventful Tuesday evening, with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator to punctuate the silence. Ben found himself aimlessly scrolling through the internet. A sudden, peculiar impulse struck him. He opened a popular street mapping website, and for no reason other than idle curiosity, typed in his own address. The digital eye of the camera zoomed in, presenting him with a familiar, yet oddly detached view of his new abode. He saw the budding azaleas by the porch, the slightly askew mailbox, the old oak tree casting long shadows on the lawn. Everything was as it should be, perfectly ordinary, perfectly mundane. Then he noticed it. Across the street, precisely opposite his own house, standing on the sidewalk, where Mrs. Henderson usually tended her rose bushes, was a figure. It wasn't distinctly human, nor was it entirely abstract. It was a blur, a smudge of visual noise, like a glitch in the digital fabric. Its edges were indistinct, as if caught between states of being, and its form was oddly elongated, a vague pillar of distorted pixels. Ben leaned closer to the screen, his initial amusement quickly giving way to a prickle of unease. It looked like static, a patch of television snow somehow transposed onto a high-definition photograph. He scrolled down the street, checking the houses of his new neighbors. The bright yellow bungalow belonging to the Millers, the stately brick colonial of the Davises. Each image was clear, crisp, devoid of any digital anomalies. He scrolled back to his own house, and there it was again. The static figure, resolute and unmoving, a dark, fuzzy void against the bright afternoon light of the image. What struck him as truly unsettling was the quality of the light. The photograph was undeniably taken during the day. The sun was high, painting sharp shadows under the eaves of houses and glinting off car windshields. Yet, the figure seemed to absorb the light, a patch of impenetrable night within the sun-drenched scene. It was a shadow where no shadow should exist, a void that defied the logic of illumination. It felt wrong, fundamentally askew, like a tear in the otherwise seamless tapestry of reality. Ben tried to rationalize it. A camera malfunction, surely. A dust mote on the lens, perhaps. A simple, explainable error in the vast algorithm of data collection. But the more he looked, the less comfortable he felt with these easy explanations. The figure was too specific, too localized. It wasn't a general blur across the image, but a distinct, albeit distorted, presence. He closed the browser, the image of the static figure lingering in his mind like a persistent afterimage. He tried to shake it off, to dismiss it as a trivial digital oddity. But as the hours stretched into night, a low-key obsession began to take root. He found himself thinking about it, wondering about it, the peculiar anomaly drawing his thoughts like a dark magnet. The next morning, his first waking thought was of the figure. He opened his laptop, navigated back to the street mapping site, and input his address. His finger hovered over the enter key, a strange mix of apprehension and morbid curiosity twisting in his gut. The image loaded, and there it was, unchanged, unmoving, a silent sentinel of static, perpetually fixed across the street from his home. This became his new, unwelcome habit. Every day, sometimes twice a day, he would check. Like a strange, digital ritual, he would summon the image of his house, hopping to see it gone, to find that the glitch had somehow resolved itself. But it never did. The static figure remained, a fixed point in a world of constant flux. The seasons changed outside his window, leaves blossomed and fell. But in the frozen digital landscape, the figure endured. It was always in the exact same spot. Its blurred form a testament to its unchanging nature. He started to project his own anxieties onto it. Was it watching him? Was it waiting? The thought was absurd, of course. It was merely pixels on a screen, a photographic anomaly. Yet, the persistent nature of its presence, its unwavering stillness, began to chip away at his rational mind. He found himself glancing out his living room window more often, a subtle, unacknowledged fear gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. He knew it was irrational, but he couldn't shake the feeling that if he were to step outside, he might glimpse it there, a dark, featureless silhouette against the mundane backdrop of his street. He even tried to manipulate the view, to rotate the angle, to zoom in as much as possible. The figure would stretch and distort. its blurred edges becoming even more pronounced. But it never revealed any more detail, never offered any clue as to its origin or nature. It remained a mystery, a dark stain on the digital canvas. Months passed. The initial unease ripened into a low-grade dread. Ben found himself discussing the Street View glitch with no one. How could he explain this irrational obsession with a static figure on a website to his new, polite neighbors? They would surely think him strange, perhaps even delusional. So he kept it to himself, a private, unsettling secret. Then one Thursday morning, as he was about to begin his daily digital pilgrimage, a notification flashed across his screen. An update. The street view for his area had been refreshed. His heart gave an unbidden lurch. This was it. This was his chance to be free of it, to finally see his street, his house, without the disturbing presence of the static figure. He clicked the notification, his breath catching in his throat. The new image loaded slowly, pixel by agonizing pixel. The scene was different, subtly but noticeably. The season had changed, evident in the fuller trees and the vibrant green of the grass. A different car, a silver sedan that wasn't his, was parked in his driveway. The subtle signs of the passage of time were evident, a testament to the fact that this was indeed a new photograph, taken months after the original. But then his eyes found it. There it was, in the exact same spot on the sidewalk across the street. The static figure. It was still blurred, still indistinct, still a patch of impenetrable darkness in the daylight. But it was undeniably the same, unmoved, unchanged. It had endured the passage of time, the shift in seasons, the arrival and departure of cars, remaining a fixed, inexplicable point in the ever-evolving landscape. A cold dread seeped into Ben's bones, far deeper and more profound than any unease he had felt before. This wasn't just a glitch, not a camera error. This was something else, something that defied logic, something that permeated time itself. The figure had been there months ago, and it was there now, a silent, unmoving witness to the mundane unfolding of suburban life. He zoomed in, his fingers trembling slightly on the mouse. The blur intensified, becoming a swirling vortex of dark pixels, hinting at a form that refused to be seen, a presence that refused to be defined. He zoomed out. The figure remained, a tiny, dark stain against the pavement. Ben felt a sudden, desperate urge to look out his window, to confirm, to deny. He walked slowly to the living room, his gaze fixed on the sidewalk across the street. The sun was bright, glinting off the newly mown grass. Mrs. Henderson's roses were in full bloom. A delivery truck rumbled past. Everything was normal, perfectly, terrifyingly normal. There was nothing there, not to his eyes, but he knew it was there in the digital realm, forever fixed across from his house. A silent, static entity watching, waiting. And for the first time, Ben truly understood the chilling horror of what he had found. It wasn't just an image on a screen anymore. It was a persistent, inexplicable presence that transcended the boundaries of time and perception. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that it would always be there, unmoving, watching, a permanent, silent resident of Finch Street. Eighth story, the scent of what's to come. Luke's world was a symphony of aromas. Not just the obvious ones, the sharp tang of lemon zest, the earthy sweetness of vanilla bean, the rich, dark embrace of melting chocolate, but the subtle nuances, the whispers of scent that most people never registered. He could tell you the precise ripeness of a strawberry by the faint aldehyde note it emitted, or the subtle difference in fermentation between two batches of sourdough starter, just by the yeasty, almost alcoholic breath they exhaled. As a pastry chef of considerable renown, this acute sense, a gift honed by years of dedication and an innate sensitivity, was his greatest asset. It allowed him to craft desserts that weren't merely delicious, but transcendent. Each bite a perfectly balanced composition of flavor and fragrance. His kitchen, a pristine sanctuary of stainless steel and polished marble, was usually a controlled environment, a canvas for his olfactory artistry. Then one Tuesday morning, the symphony developed a discordant note. He was kneading a brioche dough, the air thick with the comforting scent of butter and warm yeast, when a strange, metallic tang cut through it all. It was ozone, distinct and unmistakable, like the air after a violent lightning strike, sharp and clean, yet utterly out of place. He paused, his hands still buried in the yielding dough, and sniffed the air, turning his head slowly, like a bloodhound on a trail. Nothing. The windows were closed, the sky outside a placid, cloudless blue. There was no storm brewing, no electrical storm in sight. He dismissed it as a phantom, a trick of his overworked nose, perhaps a lingering scent from some cleaning product. An hour later, as he was pulling golden brown croissants from the oven, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the wall. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then died. The oven fan whirred to a halt. A fuse had blown, plunging his perfectly illuminated kitchen into a dim, pre-dawn gloom. He found the blown fuse, replaced it, and power was restored. A minor inconvenience, easily forgotten. A few days later, the unsettling phenomenon returned, more potent this time. He was relaxing in his living room, a space usually imbued with the faint, pleasant scent of old books and polished wood, when a heavy, damp aroma filled his nostrils. It was the unmistakable smell of freshly turned earth, rich and loamy, the kind that clings to your boots after spring rain. It was the scent of soil disturbed, of roots exposed, of something buried or unearthed. He stood up, bewildered, walking from room to room, searching for a potted plant that might have been recently watered, a stray clump of dirt dragged in from outside. There was nothing. The apartment was immaculate, the air still and dry. The scent persisted, a cloying, damp presence that seemed to cling to the very fabric of his furniture. He tried to ignore it, to attribute it to a neighbor's gardening, but it was too strong, too specific. Later that evening, the phone rang. It was his mother, her voice hushed and tearful. A distant cousin, whom Luke hadn't seen in years, had passed away suddenly. The funeral was to be held at a small, rural cemetery, surrounded by damp, freshly turned earth. The pattern began to emerge, insidious and terrifying. The scents were premonitions, abstract and maddeningly useless. He started to catalog them, a grim internal lexicon of impending doom. The faint, cloying sweetness of wilting carnations, a scent he associated with funeral parlors and forgotten bouquets, would precede news of an acquaintance's serious illness, a long, drawn-out decline. He would catch a whiff of it in the bustling bakery, amidst the sugary perfume of pastries, and a cold dread would settle in his stomach, knowing that somewhere, someone he knew was about to face a profound suffering. He tried once, desperately, to warn a colleague who had been complaining of a persistent cough. "You should really get that checked out immediately," he'd urged, the scent of wilting carnations thick in the air around them. The colleague had laughed it off, attributing Luke's urgency to his usual fastidiousness. Weeks later, the colleague was hospitalized with a severe respiratory infection, narrowly escaping a far worse fate. Luke had felt a sickening mix of vindication and despair. He had known, but he had been powerless to truly help. And there was the smell of rust, not the faint, metallic tang of old coins, but the deep, almost bloody scent of corroding iron, of decay and neglect. He first encountered it while walking through a vibrant city park, the air filled with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass. The rust smell was a jarring intrusion, a discordant note in the verdant symphony. That afternoon, a small, local bridge, long overdue for repairs, collapsed, causing minor injuries to a few pedestrians. The news report showed twisted, rusted metal girders. Luke felt a chill that had nothing to do with the summer breeze. The rust scent became a harbinger of structural failures, of things breaking down, of accidents involving metal and machinery. He smelled it once faintly in the elevator of his apartment building, and for weeks he took the stairs, a silent, solitary act of defiance against a premonition he couldn't articulate. The elevator eventually broke down, trapping several residents for hours, but Luke had been spared the claustrophobic terror. Burnt sugar. This was a particularly cruel irony for a pastry chef. The acrid, bitter smell of sugar scorched beyond caramelization, of something sweet turned foul and destructive. It would waft into his kitchen, sometimes subtle, sometimes overpowering, mingling with the delightful aromas he was trying to create. It was a smell that whispered of ruined efforts, of hopes dashed, of financial losses. He smelled it strongly the day his favorite local coffee shop, a charming independent establishment, announced its sudden closure due to insurmountable debt. He smelled it again, a faint, lingering note, before a large catering order he was preparing was unexpectedly canceled at the last minute, leaving him with mountains of perishable ingredients and a significant financial hit. Each time, the scent was a cruel mockery of his profession, a twisted reflection of his own art. He would stand amidst his perfect, fragrant creations, inhaling the scent of their antithesis, a prophet of financial sorrow, unable to warn or prevent. The cold sea salt was perhaps the most chilling. It was not the invigorating, cleansing scent of a fresh ocean breeze, but the heavy, briny smell of a vast, indifferent sea, of something lost beneath its waves. It carried with it a profound sense of emptiness, of absence, of things swallowed by the deep. He first detected it while visiting his sister, far inland, surrounded by fields and forests. The scent was so vivid, so out of place, it made him dizzy. Years later, he learned that a childhood friend, an avid sailor, had gone missing at sea during an unexpected squall. His boat was found, but his friend was not. The cold sea salt became the scent of disappearances, of people vanishing without a trace, of profound, unfillable voids. He would sometimes smell it faintly in a crowd, and a wave of nausea would wash over him, knowing that somewhere, someone was about to experience an unexplainable loss, a loved one simply ceasing to be. Helplessness gnawed at him, a constant, low thrum of anxiety beneath the surface of his daily life. He was a prophet of sorrows, but his prophecies were abstract, useless. How could he warn someone, "Beware, I smell wilting carnations. Someone you know will soon be ill." Or, "The air smells of rust. Avoid bridges and heavy machinery." He tried once with his sister after smelling the cold sea salt. He had called her, his voice tight with an unspoken dread, and urged her to call their childhood friend to check on him, to tell him to be careful. She had been puzzled, but had called. The friend had been fine then, out on his boat. The news of his disappearance came 2 days later. Luke had felt a crushing weight of guilt and futility. He had known, he had tried, but his knowledge was a curse, not a tool. His life became a slow-burn narrative of dread. Every new scent, every subtle shift in the olfactory landscape of his world became a source of profound unease. He started to avoid crowded places, fearing the sudden intrusion of a scent that would herald a public tragedy. He found himself scrutinizing the faces of strangers, wondering what unseen sorrow their presence might be foretelling. The joy he once found in his work, in the creation of beautiful, fragrant things, began to diminish, overshadowed by the constant, creeping awareness of the unseen misfortunes that permeated his reality. The rich, comforting scent of baking bread would be pierced by the acrid tang of burnt sugar, a reminder that even in creation, destruction lurked. The sweet perfume of jasmine from a flower shop would be tainted by the heavy dampness of turned earth, a whisper of mortality. He became a recluse, his social circle shrinking, his conversations becoming strained. How could he explain why he suddenly looked pale, why he seemed distracted, why he sometimes flinched at an imperceptible aroma? He couldn't. They would think him mad or morbid. He was trapped in a sensory prison, a world where the air itself whispered of impending doom, a world where he was the only one who could hear, or rather smell, its terrible secrets. The irony was exquisite. His greatest gift, the very thing that made him exceptional in his craft, had become his greatest burden. His nose, once a finely tuned instrument of culinary delight, was now a divining rod for disaster. One particularly oppressive autumn day, a new scent arrived, one he had never encountered before, and it was perhaps the most terrifying of all. It was the smell of old, stagnant water, not the fresh, earthy scent of a pond, but the sickly sweet, metallic odor of water that had been trapped, deprived of oxygen, slowly putrefying. It was the smell of something suffocated, something left to rot in darkness. It filled his apartment, clinging to his clothes, his skin, permeating every breath he took. He opened windows, lit fragrant candles, brewed strong coffee, but nothing could dispel the putrid, suffocating scent. It was everywhere, a thick, invisible shroud. He felt a profound sense of suffocation himself, a crushing weight on his chest. This was different. This wasn't a premonition of someone else's tragedy. This was personal. This was pervasive. He spent the next few days in a state of heightened panic, checking every pipe, every drain, every corner of his apartment for a leak, a stagnant puddle, anything that could explain the horrifying aroma. There was nothing. The scent remained, a constant, nauseating presence. He couldn't work, couldn't eat. Sleep offered no escape. The smell permeated his dreams, twisting them into nightmares of drowning and decay. The sheer helplessness was overwhelming. He knew something terrible was coming, something that involved suffocation, stagnation, perhaps even his own demise. But he had no idea what, or how, or when. The scent was a constant, mocking reminder of his impending doom, a silent countdown to an unknown catastrophe. He started to see shadows where there were none, to hear whispers in the silence. His once sharp mind, so adept at dissecting complex flavor profiles, was now consumed by the single, terrifying question. What did the stagnant water mean? Was it a flood, a gas leak, a slow, insidious illness? The ambiguity was the cruelest part. He was a prophet without a message, a seer without sight, merely a vessel for the premonition of sorrow, condemned to experience the chilling scent of what was to come, utterly powerless to change its course. And as the days bled into weeks, the scent of stagnant water became a permanent resident in his world, a constant, suffocating reminder of the inevitable, waiting for its moment to unfold. He breathed it in, every waking moment, the scent of his own unknown future, a future he was powerless to escape, forever haunted by the silent, terrible language of his nose. Ninth story, the phantom stop. Every night, as the city lights began to blur into a soft, distant glow, Belle would find herself on the last train home. It was a ritual, a quiet winding down after the relentless pulse of her urban job. The route was etched into her memory, a 45-minute journey, 6 stops, each one a familiar chime in the rhythm of her commute. The train itself was a comforting cocoon of muted sounds, and the gentle sway of motion, often lulling her into a state of semi-consciousness, a liminal space between the day's demands and the promise of rest. One particular Tuesday, the exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. The day had been a relentless barrage of deadlines and demanding clients, leaving her drained to the very marrow of her bones. She slumped in her seat, eyes half closed, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks, a hypnotic lullaby. They had just passed the 5th stop, Willow Creek, and the landscape outside had dissolved into the inky blackness of the open countryside. There was nothing out there but fields, dark and featureless, stretching out under the indifferent gaze of the moon. Then something shifted. The familiar hum of the train's acceleration began to diminish, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible deceleration. Belle's eyes, heavy with fatigue, fluttered open. This was wrong. There were no stops between Willow Creek and her final destination, Elmwood End. Only the vast, empty expanse of fields. Yet, the train was undeniably slowing, its momentum bleeding away, as if preparing for an unseen halt. Prickle of unease, sharp and sudden, cut through her drowsiness. She pushed herself upright, pressing her face closer to the cool glass of the window. The darkness outside was still profound, but as the train continued to lose speed, a faint, yellowish glow began to coalesce in the distance. It grew, resolving itself into the unmistakable shape of lampposts, casting pools of weak light onto what appeared to be a platform. Her breath hitched. A train station. A perfectly ordinary-looking train station, nestled incongruously in the middle of nowhere. It was small, quaint even, with a single, unassuming building and a short, empty platform. The dim light, however, was enough to illuminate a sign, stark against the dark brickwork. It read, in simple, block letters, Amberfield. The train glided past, a silent, spectral presence in the night. It didn't stop. It merely drifted, a slow, deliberate crawl past the deserted platform, past the station building with its dark windows, past the sign that declared Amberfield to the empty air. Belle watched, mesmerized and bewildered, as the entire scene slid by, a fleeting tableau of impossible normalcy. There were no people, no luggage carts, no sounds save for the faint whisper of the train's own movement. It was utterly desolate, yet undeniably there. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the deceleration ceased. The train's engines hummed back to life, a low growl that steadily intensified, and the carriage lurched forward, accelerating back into the night. The lights of Amberfield receded, shrinking rapidly, until they were swallowed once more by the all-consuming darkness. Belle pulled away from the window, her heart thumping an erratic rhythm against her ribs. She looked around the carriage. A few other passengers were scattered throughout, each engrossed in their phones, or staring blankly into space, or, like her moments before, lost in sleep. No one had reacted. Not a single head had lifted. Not a single eye had widened in surprise or confusion. It was as if she were the only one who had witnessed the impossible. A shiver traced its way down her spine, despite the warmth of the carriage. Had she dreamt it? Was it a trick of her exhausted mind, a hallucination born of fatigue? She shook her head, trying to dislodge the lingering image of the Amberfield sign. It had felt too real, too tangible. The slowing of the train, the lights, the distinct shape of the station. It couldn't have been a dream. Yet, the lack of reaction from anyone else was profoundly unsettling. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of disquiet. When she finally reached Elmwood End, the familiar platform and the short walk home offered little comfort. The image of Amberfield clung to her, an unwelcome passenger in her thoughts. She tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a momentary lapse in attention, a trick of the light, anything to explain away the inexplicable. But a seed of dreadful curiosity had been planted, and it began to sprout, its tendrils wrapping around her mind. The next night, Belle was wide awake. The exhaustion of the previous day had been replaced by a taut, nervous energy. She had deliberately chosen a seat by the window, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, her senses on high alert. She had even foregone her usual podcast, preferring the silence, the better to hear any subtle shift in the train's rhythm. The journey unfolded as it always did, the familiar stops ticking by like a metronome. Willow Creek came and went. The darkness outside deepened, becoming an impenetrable curtain. Belle leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. Her heart hammered, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet carriage. And then it happened again. The subtle, almost imperceptible slowing. The familiar hum of the engines began to fade, replaced by the soft whisper of the wheels. Belle's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her face against the window, her eyes straining against the blackness. A faint glow, just as before, began to emerge from the void. It grew, resolving itself into the same configuration of lampposts, the same small, unassuming building. And there it was, stark and undeniable, the sign. Amberfield. The train glided past, a ghost in the night, its speed diminishing to a crawl. Belle could make out the details now, clearer than the night before. The brickwork of the station building was old, weathered, but not dilapidated. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the train's own dim interior lights. The platform was utterly empty, a desolate stretch of concrete. It was exactly as she remembered it, down to the last, unsettling detail. Her gaze swept across the platform, searching for any sign of life, any anomaly. Nothing. Just the silent, empty station, bathed in its own melancholic glow. The train continued its slow, deliberate passage. And then, just as before, the engines roared back to life, pulling away from the phantom stop, leaving Amberfield to vanish into the darkness. She pulled back, trembling slightly. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. Amberfield was real, at least in the sense that the train slowed for it, passed it, and then sped away. But why? And why did no one else seem to notice? The other passengers remained oblivious, lost in their own worlds. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. This wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was a profound, unsettling mystery that seemed to exist only for her. The next day, Belle's usual focus at work was shattered. Her mind kept replaying the image of Amberfield, the silent, empty platform, the strange, fleeting appearance. During her lunch break, she found herself at her computer, not researching work-related topics, but typing Amberfield train station into a search engine. The results were immediate and profoundly unhelpful. There was no mention of any train station, past or present, called Amberfield on her line, or indeed, anywhere in the region. She tried variations, abandoned train stations between Willow Creek and Elmwood End, disused railway lines, ghost stations. Nothing. The internet, that vast repository of human knowledge, offered no answers, no crumbs of information to explain what she had seen. She consulted old maps, historical railway charts, even obscure local history forums. She spent hours poring over digitized archives, looking for any mention of a town or settlement named Amberfield in the area. The line itself was well documented, its history meticulously recorded. There was no gap, no missing link, no forgotten stop that corresponded to what she was witnessing. It was as if Amberfield simply did not exist, except for those fleeting moments on the late-night train. The more she researched, the deeper the mystery became, and with it, her dreadful curiosity intensified. It wasn't just about whether the station was real anymore. It was about why it was there, what it represented, and most chillingly, what would happen if the train ever truly stopped. The question began to consume her, a relentless whisper in the back of her mind. Her sleep suffered. The moment her head hit the pillow, the image of Amberfield would materialize behind her eyelids, the dim lights, the empty platform, the silent, waiting presence. She would wake in the dead of night, heart pounding, Convinced, she heard the distant, mournful whistle of a train. Her friends noticed a change. She was more withdrawn, distracted. When they asked if everything was all right, she would offer vague assurances, unable to articulate the strange, solitary burden she carried. How could she explain it? Oh, the train I take home stops at a ghost station that doesn't exist, and no one else sees it. They would think she was losing her mind. Perhaps she was. Each night, the journey became an ordeal. She would sit, rigid and alert, her eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the inevitable slowing, the appearance of the phantom station. Sometimes, she imagined she saw subtle changes. One night, the light seemed a fraction brighter, almost inviting. Another, the sign seemed to shimmer, as if on the verge of revealing something more. She even thought, on one occasion, she saw a faint, fleeting shadow move within the station building, but dismissed it as a trick of the eye, a product of her increasingly frayed nerves. The train, too, seemed to play its part in her torment. Some nights, it would slow almost to a complete halt, lingering for agonizing seconds before accelerating away, as if teasing her, drawing her closer to the precipice of discovery. Other nights, it would glide past with a slightly faster pace, a fleeting glimpse that left her frustrated and desperate for more. She started carrying a small, powerful flashlight, a desperate attempt to pierce the darkness, to illuminate the secrets of Amberfield. But the train's speed, even at its slowest crawl, was too great, the distance too vast. The beam of her light merely danced uselessly on the glass, reflecting her own anxious face back at her. The obsession grew, consuming her thoughts, her energy. She found herself drafting emails to railway authorities, then deleting them, knowing how absurd they would sound. She considered talking to the conductor, but what would she say? "Excuse me, do you ever notice a non-existent station called Amberfield between Willow Creek and Elmwood End?" He would surely think she was mad. The question of what would happen if the train did stop began to dominate her waking hours. Would she get off? The thought both terrified and compelled her. What if it was a trap? What if it was a gateway to something unspeakable? Or what if it was a place of profound, forgotten peace? The possibilities, each more unsettling than the last, swirled in her mind. One evening, a particularly brutal storm lashed the city. Rain hammered against the train windows, and the wind howled like a banshee. The journey was slower than usual, the train struggling against the elements. Belle, despite the tumultuous weather, was still fixated on her nightly vigil. The conditions outside made it even harder to see, the darkness intensified by the swirling rain. As they passed Willow Creek, the familiar deceleration began. Her heart leaped into her throat. The storm seemed to amplify the silence in the carriage, making the slowing of the train feel impossibly loud, impossibly significant. She pressed her face against the condensation-streaked window, peering into the tempest. Through the distorted glass, she saw it. The faint, yellowish glow struggling to pierce the veil of rain. The outline of the small station, its form blurred by the downpour. And then, the sign, Amberfield. But this time, something was different. The train was slowing more than ever before. It wasn't just gliding, it was braking. The carriage shuddered, a deep, resonant groan echoing through the metal. The lights within the train flickered, momentarily plunging the compartment into near darkness before returning with a weak, unsteady glow. Belle held her breath, her eyes wide, fixed on the approaching station. The rain lashed against the windows, creating rivulets that streamed down the glass, making Amberfield appear to weep. The platform, though still empty, seemed to loom larger, more substantial. The train continued to slow, its brakes hissing, a sound that seemed to fill the entire world. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels became a strained, grinding halt. And then, with a final, shuddering sigh, the train came to a complete stop. Silence, a profound, absolute silence descended upon the carriage, broken only by the drumming of rain against the roof and the distant, mournful wail of the wind. The air grew cold, a sudden chill seeping in from somewhere unseen. The lights inside the train, which had been flickering, now seemed to dim further, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted with every sway of the carriage. Belle stared out the window, her face inches from the glass. The station building was directly opposite her now, its dark windows like vacant eyes. The sign, Amberfield, was starkly visible, illuminated by the struggling lampposts. The platform stretched out, wet and glistening under the rain, utterly devoid of life. But then her gaze drifted to the very end of the platform, where the light faded into the deeper shadows. Something was there, a figure. It was indistinct, shrouded by the rain and the gloom, but undeniably a human shape. It stood perfectly still, facing the train, its back to the station building. It was tall, slender, and seemed to be wearing a long, dark coat. No umbrella, no hat, just standing there, exposed to the relentless downpour. A cold dread, unlike anything she had ever known, seized Belle. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It didn't move. It simply stood, a silent sentinel in the storm, waiting. She glanced around the carriage. Still, no one else seemed to notice. The few other passengers remained in their slumped positions, some still asleep, others staring blankly ahead, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of their phone screens. They were completely oblivious, locked away in their own private worlds. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. Belle felt an unbearable pressure in her chest, a desperate urge to scream, to break the oppressive quiet. She wanted to look away from the figure, but she couldn't. It was as if her gaze was glued to it, compelled by some unseen force. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure began to turn its head. Belle's breath hitched. She saw no features, only the dark, featureless silhouette against the faint light. But the movement, slow and deliberate, was directed towards her window, towards her seat. A wave of icy terror washed over her, a premonition of something terrible. Before the figure could fully turn, before she could discern any detail, a sudden, jarring lurch shook the train. The engines roared to life, a deafening sound that shattered the silence. The lights inside the carriage flared, momentarily blinding her. The train shuddered, then began to move, slowly at first. then gathering speed with alarming rapidity. Belle was thrown back against her seat, her head hitting the headrest with a dull thud. She gasped, her eyes still fixed on the window. The figure at the end of the platform was still there, but now it was receding, shrinking rapidly as the train accelerated away. For a split second, before it was swallowed by the storm and the darkness, she thought she saw it raise an arm, a slow, deliberate gesture, as if in a wave or a beckoning. Then Amberfield was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving only the relentless drumming of the rain and the accelerating rumble of the train. Belle remained frozen, trembling, her heart still pounding with a frantic, desperate rhythm. The cold dread lingered, a chilling residue of the encounter. She was no longer just curious, she was terrified. The train had stopped, and something had been waiting. The rest of the journey was a blur. She barely registered the final stop, the familiar walk home. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear and unanswered questions. Who was the figure? What did it want? And why had the train stopped that night, of all nights? She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never look at her nightly commute the same way again. The comfort of the train, the familiar rhythm, had been irrevocably shattered. Every night, as the train approached the stretch of darkness between Willow Creek and Elmwood End, her heart would pound, and her eyes would instinctively dart to the window, searching for the phantom glow. She never saw the train stop at Amberfield again. It continued its silent, spectral glide past the desolate platform, night after night. But the memory of that one terrifying stop, of the figure waiting in the rain, was burned into her mind, a permanent scar. And the question that now haunted her, far more chilling than the initial curiosity, was not what would happen if the train finally stopped, but rather, what would have happened if it had lingered just a few seconds longer? What would the figure have done? And what would it have shown her had she been able to see its face? The answer, she knew, was something she never truly wanted to discover. The phantom stop had revealed just enough to terrify her, and left the rest to the chilling depths of her own imagination. And sometimes, in the dead of night, she still heard the faint, mournful wail of a train, and wondered if Amberfield was still out there, waiting for the night the train would finally stop, and its silent passenger would step aboard. Conclusion. And so, our journey through the unsettling concludes for tonight. The veil thins, and the familiar world returns. I hope these accounts have provided a strange sort of comfort, a quiet distraction to shepherd you towards your dreams. For those of you still with me, still floating in that space between wakefulness and sleep, I wonder, which of these visitations felt the most real to you? What little oddity in your own life did it remind you of? Let me know in the comments, if you're so inclined. Until next time, sleep well if you can,